The Phoenicians were one of the most fascinating peoples of antiquity, known not only for their unparalleled skill in navigation and trade, but also for the aura of mystery that surrounds their origin and historical development. Located on the narrow coastal strip of the eastern Mediterranean, where mountainous lands descend to the sea, the Phoenicians built their identity around contact with the ocean, turning water into a pathway and the coast into a base of power. They were not a centralized empire like the Egyptians or the Assyrians, but rather a collective of independent cities that thrived as autonomous commercial centers, united by language, religion, and cultural practices. This fragmentation, far from being a weakness, was precisely what allowed each city to flourish according to its own strengths, creating an economic and cultural network that spread throughout the known world. When one thinks of the Phoenicians, merchants and navigators immediately come to mind, but they went far beyond that. They created the first phonetic alphabet, influenced neighboring religions, and left a legacy so deep that even after the destruction of their cities, their memory continued to echo in later civilizations. The word Phoenician was not what they called themselves. They identified as Canaanim, a term that later gave rise to the word Canaanites, associated with the region they inhabited. The name Phoenician comes from the ancient Greek phoenix, meaning purple, a direct reference to the most famous product of their industry. The dye extracted from the murex mollusk, used to color fabrics in an intense purple that became a symbol of power and royalty. This seemingly simple detail reveals much about how neighboring peoples saw the Phoenicians, a people tied to commerce, suppliers of luxury and sophistication, possessors of exclusive and extremely valuable techniques. While other peoples stood out for conquering vast territories, the Phoenicians became famous for connecting distant regions, carrying products, ideas, and even religious practices from one side of the Mediterranean to the other. The Phoenician territory was limited, squeezed between the inland mountains and the sea. This geography restricted land expansion, but at the same time drove an unmatched maritime vocation. Without vast fields for agriculture, the Phoenician people turned to the sea as their source of survival and wealth. Their city-states, such as Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, arose as strategic ports that not only exploited local resources, but also became platforms for contact with the entire Mediterranean world. From the coast of Anatolia to Egypt, from Greece to the islands of the western Mediterranean, Phoenician presence was felt in the form of ports, trading posts, and colonies. They did not seek large-scale military domination, but rather the control of trade routes, which allowed them to survive for centuries amidst aggressive empires that dominated the region. While Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians conquered vast territories, the Phoenicians offered indispensable services as shipbuilders, luxury merchants, and versatile diplomats. Culturally, the Phoenicians are remembered as innovators. The development of the simplified phonetic alphabet, much more practical than the complex cuneiform or hieroglyphic writing systems, was one of the most important milestones in human history. This invention, born from the need to record commercial transactions, not only facilitated the work of Phoenician merchants, but also spread to neighboring peoples, becoming the foundation of later alphabets such as Greek and Latin, which shaped Western writing to this day. In other words, Phoenician influence transcended geographic borders and reached us, present in every written word of the modern world. Moreover, the Phoenicians had a rich religion, with gods that reflected both the sea and urban life. Baal, the storm god, and Astarte, a goddess linked to fertility and war, were worshipped in monumental temples, reinforcing the importance of the sacred within a society oriented toward commerce and the sea. Despite all this greatness, the Phoenicians remained shrouded in some enigma for a long time. They rarely produced extensive accounts of their own. Their history reaches us largely through the descriptions of neighboring peoples such as Greeks, Egyptians, Romans, and Hebrews. This contributed to the ambiguous image we inherited of them, admired as ingenious merchants and distrusted as mysterious foreigners who moved between different peoples. The absence of a unified empire also made Phoenician history fragmented, more associated with each city in particular than with a central state. This uniqueness, however, is part of the reason their memory is so enduring. The Phoenicians were, above all, cultural mediators, connectors of worlds that without them might never have come into contact. Thus, the Phoenicians can be understood as the vital link that stitched together the fabric of the ancient Mediterranean. They were not mass conquerors, but disseminators of culture, technique, and innovation. Their heritage remains alive not only in archaeological ruins or in the accounts of ancient chroniclers, but also in the very foundation of our writing and in commercial traditions that date back to this people of the sea. It is impossible to understand the history of the ancient world without considering the importance of this enigmatic group who knew how to transform geographic limitation into opportunity and make the sea not a barrier, but an endless road of possibilities. The origin of the Phoenicians is deeply tied to the peculiar geography of the eastern Mediterranean, where a narrow strip of fertile land lies between the mountains and the sea. This region, known as the Levant, had been inhabited since remote times by Semitic peoples, farmers and shepherds, who lived in small villages scattered across the coastal plains and slopes. Between the years of 3000 and 2000 before Christ, these groups began to develop more complex urban societies, organized around cities that functioned as economic and religious hubs. It was in this context that the direct ancestors of the Phoenicians emerged, heirs of Canaanite traditions, and influenced both by neighboring powers, such as the Egyptians to the south and the Mesopotamians to the east, and by the need to adapt to a land limited in natural resources. Unlike other fertile regions that favored the rise of great agricultural empires, the Phoenician coast never allowed large-scale expansion, which led its inhabitants to seek creative alternatives in order to prosper. The earliest historical references to the Phoenicians date back to Egyptian documents describing trade contacts with cities like Byblos. This city, which would become one of the oldest and most important centers of the region, was already known as a supplier of cedar wood, highly valued for construction and shipbuilding. The very name Byblos became forever linked to the world of letters, as centuries later it was adopted by the Greeks to refer to books and writing. This detail is symbolic, for it foreshadows the central role the Phoenicians would play in the diffusion of knowledge. Ancient Egypt, especially during the Middle and New Kingdoms, maintained intense relations with Byblos, establishing a trade route in which the Phoenicians offered wood, resins, and artisanal products, receiving in exchange gold, papyrus, and luxury items. These contacts not only enriched Phoenician cities, but also integrated them into a network of cultural influences that would shape their identity. From a cultural standpoint, the Phoenicians did not arise from a sudden rupture, but from a process of continuity. They were essentially Canaanites who differentiated themselves over time due to their maritime and commercial orientation. While other Semitic peoples remained focused on agriculture and herding, the inhabitants of the Phoenician coast turned to the sea and discovered in it their primary source of survival. This transition can be seen both in archaeological remains, which reveal intense production of pottery and objects related to navigation, and in foreign records highlighting the Phoenicians' role as intermediaries. Their language, belonging to the Semitic branch, shared roots with Hebrew and Aramaic but would become best known for its revolutionary role in writing. From their origins, therefore, the Phoenicians embodied the duality of tradition and innovation, a people who inherited ancestral cultural elements but reinvented themselves according to the demands of their environment. The geographic location of the Phoenician cities was a decisive factor in their formation. Squeezed between the sea and the Lebanon mountain range, these communities had little room for agricultural expansion, but enjoyed vast forest resources and direct access to maritime routes. The famous cedars of Lebanon, majestic trees that could reach great height and durability, became one of the symbols of Phoenician trade from the earliest times. The abundance of superior quality timber allowed the Phoenicians to specialize in the construction of robust, efficient ships that would form the basis of their maritime supremacy. In addition, the strategic position of the Phoenician coast, at the crossroads between the East and the Western Mediterranean, made these city-states natural intermediaries between major civilizations. This geographical scenario, which might have been perceived as a limitation, was transformed into an opportunity for the development of a culture oriented toward contact, exchange, and adaptation. Another essential aspect to understand the origins of the Phoenicians is their relationship with divinities and the spiritual world. From the earliest records, religion held a central place in their social life. Temples were not only places of worship, but also centers of political and economic organization. Deities connected to fertility, the sea, and storms were especially revered, reflecting the daily life of a people who depended both on maritime trade and on the productivity of a narrow and limited land. This religiosity also proved flexible. The Phoenicians absorbed influences from the Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and other neighbors, incorporating elements that reinforced their cosmopolitan identity. This cultural openness would become one of the most enduring marks of their civilization, allowing them to create a living religion in constant dialogue with surrounding peoples. Thus, the Phoenicians were born from a fusion of tradition and adaptation. Children of Canaanite land but shaped by the sea and the necessity of survival, they built their identity around vibrant cities that would become symbols of Mediterranean commerce and culture. Their origin cannot be seen as a fixed point, but as a gradual process in which geographic, economic, and cultural factors converged to shape a unique people. From the very beginning, the Phoenicians demonstrated their vocation as mediators between different worlds, a characteristic that would define their entire historical trajectory. When we think of the Phoenicians, we should not imagine a unified empire under a single ruler, but rather a mosaic of independent city-states, each with its own political, economic, and religious dynamics. Among them, 3 names stood out as pillars of Phoenician civilization: Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. These cities not only became prestigious commercial centers, but also radiated culture, technology, and influence throughout the Mediterranean. They were, in many ways, the beating heart of Phoenician identity, each with unique characteristics that contributed to the whole of this maritime civilization. By studying their histories, we can understand how the Phoenicians shaped commerce, religion, and politics in the ancient world. Byblos, the oldest of these cities, dates back to immemorial times. Located in a fertile region blessed with excellent port conditions, Byblos maintained close ties with Egypt as early as the 3rd millennium before Christ. It was the main supplier of the famous cedars of Lebanon, timber of exceptional quality used by the Egyptians in the construction of ships, temples, and sarcophagi. The name Byblos became eternally linked to the word book, since Egyptian papyrus exported through this city was so associated with it that the Greeks adopted the term to designate writing itself. This detail illustrates how Byblos became a vital link between cultures, exporting not only wood, but also ideas and products that shaped entire civilizations. Its religious prestige was also remarkable, with temples dedicated to deities such as Balat Gebal, considered the lady of the city. The splendor of Byblos made it one of the earliest and most enduring expressions of Phoenician power. Sidon, in turn, distinguished itself as one of the greatest ports and commercial hubs of antiquity. Located in a strategic position, it became a meeting point for merchants from various parts of the Mediterranean. Its craftsmen were renowned, especially for the production of glass, perfumes, and fabrics dyed with the famous Phoenician purple, extracted from the murex mollusk. Sidon gained fame not only for the quality of its products, but also for the skill of its navigators, who ventured farther and farther, establishing trade and cultural contacts that expanded Phoenician influence. Moreover, the city had a well-structured political organization, led by kings who maintained strategic alliances with neighboring empires. Sidon thus became a model of a cosmopolitan city, open to external influences, yet proud of its traditions and accumulated wealth. Tyre, perhaps the most celebrated of the Phoenician cities, achieved unparalleled prestige. Built partly on an island near the coast, it had an almost impregnable location, which gave it great defensive advantages against enemies. Tyre became a symbol of Phoenician wealth, accumulated through long-distance maritime trade. It was from Tyre that expeditions departed to found colonies throughout the western Mediterranean, including powerful Carthage, which would later rival Rome. The prestige of Tyre was so intertwined with its maritime strength that even great empires like the Assyrian and the Babylonian struggled to subjugate it completely. King Hiram I, one of Tyre's most famous rulers, established diplomatic and commercial relations with King David and King Solomon of Israel, providing timber and craftsmen for the construction of the Temple of Jerusalem. This example reveals how Tyre was not only a commercial power, but also a diplomatic and cultural center of great importance in the ancient Near East. What makes these city-states unique is the way they coexisted in relative independence while maintaining a shared identity. Although they competed in prestige and influence, all shared elements of the Phoenician language, religion, and commercial practices. This decentralization did not prevent the creation of a solid network that connected East and West, consolidating the Phoenicians as cultural and economic mediators. Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre were not merely prosperous cities. They were true beacons of a seafaring civilization whose strength lay in adaptability and the relentless pursuit of new opportunities. In each of them, we can see the essence of Phoenicia: ingenuity, resilience, and openness to the world. Thus, when we look at these early city-states, we see not only the birth of Phoenician civilization, but also the foreshadowing of its lasting legacy. Every port, every temple, and every ship that departed from their shores carried the mark of a people who learned to transform geographical limitations into cultural and economic power. Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre were the foundations of a maritime empire that did not dominate through military might, but through mastery of trade and the ability to connect peoples and cultures in a way unique in human history. Phoenician cities were much more than mere trading posts on the seashore. They were living organisms, designed to sustain urban life, religiosity, and maritime activities that defined their identity. Unlike centralized empires that erected monumental capitals to express territorial power, the Phoenician cities concentrated their strength in urban dynamism and port efficiency. Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, each in its own way, revealed an architectural organization that reflected the priority given to the sea, religion, and ruling elites. Ports, temples, and palaces were not just physical structures, but symbols of how this people understood the world, balancing the practical life of trade with sacred and political dimensions. The port was the heart of the Phoenician city. There, ships arrived loaded with exotic goods from the most distant regions of the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians developed advanced port construction techniques, creating secure docks, warehouses, and areas for ship repair. In Tyre, for example, there were double harbors, one facing north and the other facing south, allowing ships to dock under different wind and tide conditions. These spaces were in constant motion, with dock workers, merchants, and sailors transforming the port into a daily spectacle of cultural diversity. It was there that business was decided, alliances were established, and the reputation of the cities as indispensable intermediaries in international trade was consolidated. Temples held a central role in the urban landscape, both physically and spiritually. Built in strategic locations, often on elevated ground or near the sea, they symbolized the constant presence of the gods in daily life. In Byblos, the temple dedicated to Baalat Gebal was considered one of the oldest religious structures in the region, a place of pilgrimage and a center of political power. In Sidon and Tyre, monumental temples dedicated to Baal and Astarte reinforced the connection between religion and commerce. Phoenician deities were closely tied to fertility, storms, the sea, and prosperity, reflecting the practical concerns of a people who depended both on limited agricultural success and on the safety of maritime routes. The temple was also a place for storing tributes and treasures, functioning as a true economic institution of the city. Palaces, in turn, represented the authority of the kings who governed each city-state. Unlike Egyptian or Mesopotamian constructions, Phoenician palaces were not marked by colossal dimensions, but rather by a combination of functionality and refined ostentation. Built with cedar wood and decorated with ivory and precious metals, these buildings housed not only the royal family, but also the administrative and diplomatic center. From these palaces, commercial treaties, alliance agreements, and even religious pacts with neighboring peoples were organized. Palatial architecture reflected the Phoenician ability to unite Canaanite tradition with external influences, creating a hybrid style that engaged in dialogue with different cultures while preserving its own identity. Urban life in Phoenician cities was intense and diverse. Streets bustled with merchants, craftsmen, sailors, and foreigners from across the Mediterranean. Craft workshops produced glass, ceramics, purple-dyed textiles, and ivory objects that became luxury goods coveted by kings and nobles in other lands. Internal trade mingled with external commerce, and the sound of foreign languages was common in city markets and squares. This cosmopolitan atmosphere turned Phoenician cities into true cultural melting pots, where Eastern, Western, and African traditions converged within the same urban space. This coexistence also favored the dissemination of ideas and techniques, making the city-state centers of innovation and cultural exchange. Ports, temples, and palaces were therefore the triad that sustained Phoenician life. They represented, respectively, the economic base, the religious soul, and the political power of the cities. Together, they composed a vibrant urban setting where every stone, every ship, and every ceremony expressed the balance the Phoenicians sought between practical survival, spiritual devotion, and governmental authority. Unlike other civilizations that left behind grand monuments like pyramids or ziggurats, the Phoenicians built their greatness on the efficiency of their urban spaces and their ability to connect peoples and cultures. This choice reveals much about their character. They were bridge builders between worlds, more concerned with circulation and mediation than with erecting symbols of absolute power. Thus, Phoenician urban culture consolidated itself as a reflection of its maritime and commercial vocation. Their cities were the mirror of their collective identity, each with its singularity, but all driven by the same logic: to live from the sea, for the sea, and through the sea. In the ports was the beating life, in the temples divine protection, and in the palaces political organization. This structure would be fundamental for Phoenician expansion, which would soon take their ships to found colonies in distant lands, spreading their influence far beyond the narrow Levantine shores where it all began. Phoenician religion was a central force that permeated every aspect of urban, political, and commercial life. For this seafaring people, the gods were not distant beings in an abstract realm, but present entities who directly influenced harvests, storms, voyages, and even military victories. Each city-state had its monumental temples and specific cults, yet there was a common religious foundation that united them around the same pantheon. The sacred was expressed through rituals, offerings, and festivals that reinforced not only faith, but also collective identity. At the same time, this religiosity was marked by flexibility. The Phoenicians absorbed deities and practices from neighboring peoples, reinterpreting them within their own worldview. Thus, Phoenician religion was both a reflection of Canaanite tradition and a creation of its own, shaped by constant contact with other cultures. Among the Phoenician deities, Baal was one of the most important and revered. His name simply means Lord, but his power manifested as the god of storms, agricultural fertility, and war. In a region where climate and harvests were unstable, Baal symbolized the hope for rain and abundance, but also the destructive power of lightning and tempests. His temples were imposing, and he was often depicted as a warrior armed with lightning bolts and spears. The cult of Baal included animal sacrifices and votive offerings, but accounts from ancient authors also suggest the practice of more extreme rituals, such as human sacrifices in times of crisis. This darker image, though possibly exaggerated by the Phoenicians' enemies, deeply influenced the biblical tradition, where Baal appears as a direct rival of the God of Israel. Alongside Baal, the goddess Astarte held a central role. Linked to fertility, love, sexuality, and also to war, Astarte was a multifaceted deity who embodied both life and destruction. Depicted as a powerful female figure, often associated with lunar and astral symbols, she was worshipped in luxurious temples and through rituals that sought her blessing for prosperous harvests and protection in battle. Her cult spread across different regions, directly influencing Greek goddesses such as Aphrodite and Artemis, and Roman deities such as Venus and Diana. This connection shows how Phoenician religiosity did not remain confined to their own borders, but radiated throughout the Mediterranean, shaping the religious imagination of other peoples. Astarte was, in many senses, the feminine face of Phoenician power, at once seductive, creative, and destructive. Another striking feature of the Phoenician pantheon was the presence of local deities specific to each city. In Byblos, the goddess Baalat Gebal was the city's protector, associated with fertility and commerce. In Sidon, Eshmun was worshipped as the god of healing and health, receiving pilgrims in search of miracles and cures. In Tyre, Melkart, the king of the city, was the supreme deity, symbolizing strength, urban protection, and the spirit of maritime expansion. Melkart was so significant that the Greeks identified him with Hercules, a clear example of how Phoenician gods merged with Greek mythology. This phenomenon of religious syncretism was constant, since the Phoenicians were always in contact with different cultures and absorbed their elements without losing their own identity. Phoenician rituals varied depending on the city and the deity worshipped, but they almost always included offerings, sacrifices, and communal festivals. Religious practices were not only spiritual, but also social and political, since kings often presented themselves as representatives or chosen ones of the gods. Temples functioned as centers of power, accumulating wealth and organizing ceremonies that reinforced the prestige of the elites. Religion was also closely tied to navigation. Sailors made prayers and offerings before embarking on long journeys, asking for protection against storms and pirates. Faith, therefore, was not separate from daily life, but the thread that connected domestic life, commerce, politics, and war. Phoenician religion, although fragmented among independent cities, had an impressive capacity for adaptation. While preserving their local deities, they absorbed Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and later Greek influences. This flexibility allowed their gods to cross borders, being reinterpreted in new cultures. Baal, Astarte, Melkart, and Eshmun did not remain confined to the Levant, but traveled on Phoenician ships, spreading through colonies such as Carthage and influencing Mediterranean religiosity. This religious heritage, blended with legends and traditions, helped consolidate the image of the Phoenicians as cultural mediators, not only of material goods, but also of beliefs and myths. Thus, the Phoenician pantheon was the expression of a people deeply connected to the forces of nature, the sea, and commerce. Their gods reflected the needs and hopes of a society that lived in constant uncertainty, the risk of storms, the fragility of harvests, and the threats of neighboring empires. Religion provided them not only with spiritual protection, but also with social cohesion and collective identity. The worship of Baal, Astarte, and many other deities formed the basis of a dynamic and influential spirituality that left indelible marks on the history of world religiosity. Among all the contributions the Phoenicians left to humanity, none was as revolutionary as the creation of the phonetic alphabet, a writing system that forever transformed the way humans recorded information, transmitted ideas, and preserved knowledge. Unlike the complex cuneiform systems of Mesopotamia or the elaborate Egyptian hieroglyphs, which required years of training and were restricted to specialized scribes, the Phoenician alphabet was simple, practical, and accessible, composed of signs that represented specific sounds rather than entire words or concepts. It reduced writing to a set of symbols that any instructed person could learn quickly. This simplification not only democratized writing, but also became the basis for later alphabets such as Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, shaping the cultural destiny of both the Western and Eastern worlds. The context that led to the emergence of this alphabet is deeply tied to the Phoenicians' commercial vocation. As tireless merchants and navigators, they needed an efficient recording system to account for transactions, contracts, and goods. Cuneiform or hieroglyphic writing was functional, but slow and inaccessible to most traders. The Phoenicians, with their pragmatic skill, created an alphabet of about 22 consonants that could be adapted to different languages. This set of symbols allowed any word to be recorded simply by combining sounds. Its simplicity was its greatest strength. While other systems required hundreds of signs, the Phoenician alphabet reduced writing to a portable and universal code, ideal to be carried on ships and reproduced in different ports. From a historical perspective, the invention of the Phoenician alphabet represented a true cultural revolution. As they expanded their trade routes across the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians also spread their writing. In Greece, for example, contact with Phoenician merchants led the Hellenes to adopt and adapt this system, adding vowels that did not exist in the original model. The result was the Greek alphabet, which in turn inspired the Latin alphabet, still used in much of the world today. In the Levant, the Phoenician alphabet directly influenced Hebrew and Aramaic, languages that played fundamental roles in religious traditions such as Judaism and Christianity. In other words, Phoenician heritage is present in almost all the written texts of the modern world, from Greek classics to the Bible, from Latin literature to the administrative records of later empires. Another fascinating aspect of the Phoenician alphabet is its role as a tool of cultural identity. Although the Phoenicians were not a centralized empire, the sharing of a common written language served as a bond of unity among their city-states and colonies. A merchant from Tyre could negotiate in Carthage or Byblos using the same writing system, which facilitated transactions and reinforced cultural ties. This universality of writing also explains how the alphabet could be absorbed by other peoples. It was practical, neutral, and adaptable, not bound to a specific cosmology or religion. This characteristic was fundamental to its survival and expansion, making it one of the most influential systems in human history. The impact of the Phoenician alphabet goes beyond writing itself. It symbolizes the very essence of the Phoenician spirit, marked by the search for practical solutions, the ability to adapt, and the skill to connect cultures. Just as their ships linked distant ports, their alphabet linked diverse languages and traditions. It was not only a code of sounds, but a vehicle of cultural exchange. The invention of this writing system is proof of the fundamental role the Phoenicians played as mediators between East and West, as creators of cultural bridges that would survive long after their own civilization had disappeared. Thus, the Phoenician alphabet can be considered one of the greatest legacies ever left by an ancient people. It is present in every book, every document, every text that has crossed centuries and reached us. Without it, the history of literature, philosophy, science, and religion would be profoundly different. By creating such a simple and universal system, the Phoenicians not only made life easier for their contemporaries, but also laid the foundations for the entire written tradition that would shape humanity. Their alphabet is ultimately proof that true power does not lie only in weapons or palaces, but also in the ability to create tools that transform thought and communication. Trade was the soul of Phoenician civilization, and the main reason for its fame in the ancient world. Unlike other peoples who sought glory through military conquest or territorial expansion, the Phoenicians built their power on their ability to mediate exchanges between distant regions. Their ships sailed the Mediterranean like true floating bridges between cultures, carrying products, techniques, and ideas that circulated from east to west. The narrow coastline where they lived, with little arable land, imposed limitations on agriculture, but at the same time forced them to look to the sea as their greatest wealth. There they found not only fish and roots, but also the path to becoming indispensable to the economic functioning of the entire Mediterranean. Their commercial vocation was so remarkable that centuries later, Greek and Roman historians still referred to them as the merchants of the world. The goods transported by the Phoenicians were varied and of high value. Among the most famous products was cedar wood, abundant in the mountains of Lebanon, prized for its durability and aroma, and used in the construction of temples, palaces, and ships by Egyptians, Assyrians, and other peoples. Another prestigious item was Tyrian purple, a luxurious dye extracted from the murex mollusk, whose production required thousands of shells to dye just a small amount of fabric. This color, a symbol of power and exclusivity, was worn by kings, priests, and nobles throughout antiquity, making it one of the most profitable products of Phoenician trade. In addition, the Phoenicians traded glass, perfumes, ceramics, jewelry, ivory, and metal objects, while importing gold, silver, tin, wheat, papyrus, spices, and slaves. They were specialists in transforming local raw materials into refined goods, adding value and creating a sophisticated consumer network that connected different peoples. The reach of Phoenician trade routes is impressive. From the Levant, their ships traveled across the eastern Mediterranean, reaching Egypt and Greece. They crossed the sea towards southern Italy and Sicily. They established trading posts in Sardinia, the Iberian Peninsula, and North Africa. Some expeditions went even farther, reaching the Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar. Ancient accounts suggest that the Phoenicians reached the British Isles in search of tin, a metal essential for bronze production. Other, more legendary reports point to the possibility that they explored as far as the African coast, demonstrating a maritime daring unmatched in their time. This ability to sail long distances was sustained by advanced shipbuilding techniques, with robust vessels equipped with oars and sails, capable of facing both calm seas and violent storms. Phoenician trade activity was not limited to the exchange of goods, but also served as a vehicle for cultural transmission. Each port where their ships docked became a meeting point of languages, religions, customs, and technologies. The Phoenicians introduced their alphabet, spread myths, and influenced artistic styles in distant regions. In turn, they absorbed cultural elements from the peoples with whom they traded, creating an open, flexible, and cosmopolitan civilization. This constant exchange made the Phoenicians cultural mediators, who not only enriched themselves through the trade of material goods, but also shaped the imagination and traditions of the ancient Mediterranean. In many regions, the Phoenicians were remembered as mysterious foreigners, but also as bearers of novelties and symbols of sophistication. Another essential factor was the organization of colonies and trading posts. Unlike empires that colonized to impose military control, the Phoenicians established strategic outposts to support their commercial network. These stations functioned as resupply points, local markets, and centers of cultural diffusion. Carthage, in present-day Tunisia, was the most famous of these colonies, but many others spread across the Mediterranean, consolidating Phoenician control over vital routes. This maritime expansion gave the Phoenicians a network of influence that rivaled great empires, even without vast armies or continuous territories. Their strength lay precisely in fluidity, in their ability to adapt to different contexts and negotiate with enemies or allies as needed. In summary, maritime trade was the essence of Phoenician power. More than simple merchants, they were architects of an international economy that connected East and West in an unprecedented system of exchange. Their ships carried not only goods, but also ideas, techniques, and beliefs that shaped entire civilizations. The sea, which for many peoples represented a barrier, was for the Phoenicians an open road full of possibilities. It was there that they built their wealth, their reputation, and their immortal legacy, becoming protagonists of one of the most fascinating stories of antiquity. Phoenician trade was not limited to the act of transporting goods. It depended on well-established routes, networks of trust, and products that carried both economic and symbolic value. Over centuries, the Phoenicians developed a true web of maritime and land routes that connected the eastern Mediterranean to the most distant regions of the West, creating a constant flow of goods that sustained their economy and consolidated their reputation as great merchants. Among all the products that circulated along these routes, 4 became particularly emblematic: wood, glass, purple dye, and metals. Each had a strategic importance, and together they represented the essence of Phoenician wealth. Cedar wood was perhaps the most valuable resource exported from the cities of the Levant. Harvested from the mountains that rose behind the narrow Phoenician coast, this wood was famous for its durability, aroma, and resistance. Peoples such as the Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and Israelites depended on the Phoenicians to obtain it, since in their own lands this resource was scarce or non-existent. Cedars were used in the construction of temples, palaces, and ships, becoming symbols of luxury and solidity. The prestige of Phoenician wood even appears in biblical texts, such as the descriptions of the Temple of Jerusalem, whose structure included cedars supplied by King Hiram of Tyre. The Phoenicians not only cut and transported the wood, but also specialized in carpentry and shipbuilding techniques, further increasing the value of this resource in their trade routes. Another product that defined Phoenician trade was glass, a craft the Phoenicians mastered with excellence. Ancient accounts attribute to them the invention of glass-making, although it is more likely that they perfected techniques already known elsewhere. What is certain is that Phoenician artisans produced glass of incomparable quality, transparent, colored, or molded into sophisticated forms, which was exported throughout the Mediterranean. Phoenician glass was much more than a functional object. It was a prestige item, used in jewelry, perfume containers, and luxury utensils. This technical mastery reinforced the image of the Phoenicians as masters of craftsmanship, capable of transforming simple raw materials into high-value goods. Along their routes, glass was exchanged for metals, wheat, gold, and other essential products, consolidating their role in international exchange. No product, however, became as symbolic of Phoenician identity as the Tyrian purple dye. This rare pigment was extracted from the murex mollusk, abundant in the waters of the eastern Mediterranean. The production process was extremely laborious. Thousands of shells had to be crushed to obtain small amounts of the purplish liquid, which then underwent drying and fixation. The result was a fabric dyed in an intense purple that did not fade with time and became even more vibrant over the years. Due to its rarity and difficult production, purple became a symbol of power, reserved for kings, priests, and aristocrats. Wearing purple garments was the highest mark of prestige, and in many ancient cultures only rulers had the right to this color. The fame of Tyrian purple spread so widely that the very name Phoenician is linked to the Greek phoenix, meaning purple. Phoenician trade was also vital for the circulation of metals, especially tin, copper, and silver. Tin in particular was of enormous importance because, when combined with copper, it produced bronze, a metal alloy essential for weapons, tools, and utensils. Ancient sources mention that the Phoenicians reached as far as the Iberian Peninsula and the British Isles in search of metal mines, establishing routes that spanned the entire Mediterranean. On these journeys, they carried manufactured goods and returned loaded with mineral wealth, which was then redistributed in eastern markets. This search for metals explains part of Phoenician colonial expansion and demonstrates their ability to transform the sea into an economic corridor linking extremely distant regions. Thus, Phoenician trade routes were not just lines of navigation. They were complex structures that depended on outposts, diplomatic alliances, and a network of trust built over centuries. Wood sustained the constructions and ships of foreign kings. Glass adorned the most refined courts. Purple dressed sovereigns and priests, and metals fueled the engines of warfare and agriculture in antiquity. Each product was an indispensable link in this chain that united cultures, and every Phoenician ship that departed from Tyre, Sidon, or Byblos carried not only goods, but also the reputation of a people who knew how to transform resources into power and influence. By observing these routes and products, we see how the Phoenicians managed to transform geographic limitations into economic opportunities. Their narrow land did not allow for large-scale farming, but it offered majestic cedars. The sea gave them access to rare shells and mollusks. Their artisanal ingenuity turned sand into glass and simple materials into luxury items. Metals, in turn, led them beyond the horizon, opening paths to regions never before explored. These four elements, wood, glass, purple dye, and metals, were the pillars of a maritime economy that made the Phoenicians protagonists of one of the most impressive commercial stories of antiquity. Among all the products that defined Phoenician identity, none achieved as much prestige as your purple dye, known as Tyrian purple. More than a simple pigment, it became a symbol of power, wealth, and social distinction, reserved for kings, priests, and the most influential elites of the ancient world. Its value was so high that a single fabric dyed in this color could cost the equivalent of its weight in gold. The name Phoenician, derived from the Greek phoenix, is directly associated with this shade, since phoenix literally means purple. This linguistic detail reveals how neighboring peoples associated Phoenician identity not only with their commercial ability, but also with the mastery of this rare product that transformed a color into a symbol of sovereignty. The production of purple dye was extremely laborious and required a process remarkable for its complexity. The pigment was extracted from a mollusk called murex, found in abundance in the waters along the Phoenician coast. To obtain small amounts of the necessary liquid, thousands of shells had to be crushed, a specific gland removed, and left to dry under the sun until it reached the desired hue. The result was an intense, deep, and long-lasting pigment that not only resisted fading but became even more vibrant over time. This effect of permanence made purple fabric stand out from all others, transmitting the idea of immortality and eternal power. It is no coincidence that kings and emperors of different cultures adopted purple as their official color, directly associating it with supreme authority. The most famous center of this production was Tyre, the city-state that made purple its main source of wealth and prestige. The workshops of Tyre became legendary, supplying palaces in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. The association between Tyre and purple was so strong that in many ancient texts, mentioning the city was almost synonymous with mentioning the dye itself. This monopoly gave Tyre enormous economic and diplomatic power, allowing its kings to negotiate on equal terms with greater powers and to maintain independence for long periods. The wealth accumulated through the export of purple not only financed the luxurious life of the elites, but also the construction of temples, palaces, and fortifications that established Tyre as one of the jewels of the Mediterranean. The use of purple went far beyond aesthetics and carried profound symbolic meaning. In many cultures, only rulers were allowed to wear garments dyed with this color, creating a visible barrier between royalty and the common people. Priests also wore purple robes during sacred rituals, reinforcing the association between the color and divine contact. In Rome, centuries later, purple would become the symbol of imperial authority, with specific laws prohibiting its use by anyone other than the emperor. This symbolic weight was born in Phoenician workshops and spread across the world, cementing purple as one of the most meaningful colors in human history. The economic importance of purple can be measured by the impact it had on Phoenician trade routes. The dye was one of the most expensive and sought-after items, ensuring the Phoenicians' long-term contracts and privileged relations with foreign kings. Ships loaded with purple fabrics left Tyre and Sidon for Egypt, Greece and Asia Minor, where they were received as diplomatic gifts or sold at exorbitant prices. This luxury trade not only enriched the Phoenician cities, but also consolidated their image as masters of refinement and exclusivity. While other peoples stood out for agricultural products or precious metals, the Phoenicians built their reputation around a color, transforming it into a civilizational brand. Finally, Phoenician purple is also a symbol of human ingenuity in transforming natural resources into cultural power. A common mollusk, found in abundance on Mediterranean shores, was turned by skillful hands into one of the most coveted articles of antiquity. This process, which combined technical knowledge, hard labor, and aesthetic sense, expresses the essence of the Phoenician spirit, the ability to see value where others saw only simplicity, and to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. The legacy of Tyrian purple endured through centuries, remaining associated with power even into the medieval era, when kings and bishops still wore purple as a sign of supreme authority. Thus, purple dye was not merely a commodity, it was a symbol that defined the identity of a people, financed their prosperity, and immortalized their name in humanity's memory. The color of kings was born on Phoenician shores, and ever since has never ceased to carry the weight of royalty and glory. Phoenician supremacy in maritime trade would not have been possible without the mastery this people developed in the art of navigation. More than mere merchants, the Phoenicians were naval engineers, explorers, and strategists of the sea, capable of transforming their ships into instruments of power and survival. If Phoenician cities were renowned for their bustling ports and luxurious products, the ships were the vital link that connected all these riches to the Mediterranean. Thanks to their technical skill and mastery of routes, the Phoenicians overcame natural barriers, established colonies in distant regions, and created a true commercial empire sustained by the waters. The sea was their territory, and the ships, their greatest weapon. Phoenician ships stood out for both their robustness and versatility. They developed two main types of vessels: merchant ships, designed to transport large loads, and warships, built for speed and maneuverability in combat. The merchants were broad, with rounded hulls and large cargo capacity, ideal for transporting timber, metals, glass, and textiles across long distances. Warships, such as the famous galleys, were narrower, equipped with rows of oars and sails, allowing propulsion by both human force and wind. These galleys were fast and agile, able to confront pirates or impose authority in contested waters. The design of these ships was so efficient that it directly influenced Greek and Roman vessels in later centuries. Phoenician nautical technology was equally impressive. They were masters of naval carpentry, using Lebanon's cedars to build strong and durable ships. Their hulls were reinforced with tightly fitted planks held by bronze nails, which increased watertightness and safety on the high seas. They also employed stone and later metal anchors, thick hemp ropes, and triangular sails that allowed them to maneuver even against unfavorable winds. For navigation, they relied on their knowledge of the stars, maritime currents, and seasons, developing a practical science that gave them an advantage over other peoples. Tradition even attributes to the Phoenicians the exploration of the Atlantic and the circumnavigation of Africa under the sponsorship of Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt around the 6th century before Christ, a feat that attests to their daring and nautical expertise. Phoenician maritime route speeders were carefully planned. From the eastern Mediterranean, they sailed toward Egypt, Greece, Cyprus, and Anatolia. They then moved west to southern Italy, Sicily, and Sardinia, reaching the Iberian Peninsula and the Strait of Gibraltar. Crossing the boundary between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, they reached the rich tin mines of Brittany and possibly the British Isles. This impressive network of routes made the Phoenicians true masters of the sea, controlling the flow of metals, textiles, and luxury items between east and west. Each outpost founded on an island or distant coast served as a support base, ensuring supplies and safety for increasingly long voyages. Thus, the Mediterranean became a Phoenician lake, constantly traversed by ships that connected different cultures. Another notable aspect was the Phoenician adaptation to maritime dangers. Pirates, storms, and rival attacks were constant threats, and the Phoenicians knew how to face them. Their warships provided protection for merchant fleets, and their skillful diplomacy allowed them to negotiate with local peoples for safety in strategic ports. They also developed night camouflage techniques, using darkness to escape attacks. This combination of naval engineering, astronomical knowledge, and practical strategies turned the Phoenicians into almost legendary navigators, whose fame echoed throughout the ancient world. For the Greeks, the Phoenicians were both commercial partners and formidable rivals, always remembered as masters of the sea. Phoenician navigation was not merely an economic activity. It shaped the very identity of this people. While others built their history on land, the Phoenicians wrote theirs upon the waves of the Mediterranean. Their ships were extensions of their cities, carrying not only goods, but also their language, writing, gods, and culture. Each voyage was an opportunity for contact, exchange, and expansion. Thanks to their fleet, they survived in a world dominated by much larger land empires, turning their geographic fragility into maritime supremacy. The Phoenicians made the sea the stage of their greatness and left behind the lesson that innovation and boldness can transform limitations into power. Thus, Phoenician navigation was the driving force of their civilization. With ingenious ships, advanced techniques, and the courage to face unknown horizons, they built a network that united continents and laid the foundations of international trade. The sea, which for many peoples represented fear and uncertainty, was for the Phoenicians the open road of destiny. Each ship that departed from Tyre, Sidon, or Byblos was not just a vehicle of goods, but an ambassador of a culture that never ceased to sail toward the future. Phoenician expansion across the Mediterranean was one of the boldest and most strategic movements of antiquity. Unlike empires that advanced with armies to conquer territories, the Phoenicians extended their reach through the founding of colonies, trading posts, and commercial stations. This form of colonization did not aim to impose large-scale military control, but rather to secure support points for their maritime routes and to consolidate networks of exchange that sustained their economy. Over centuries, their ships spread Phoenician presence from the Levant to North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, and even the mysterious islands of the Atlantic. This network of colonies formed a true maritime empire, decentralized and flexible, which allowed the Phoenicians to remain relevant even in the face of pressure from more powerful land empires. The most notable example of this colonization was Carthage, founded around the 9th century before Christ, according to tradition, by settlers from Tyre. Located in a privileged position in North Africa, near the present region of Tunisia, Carthage quickly emerged as one of the greatest commercial centers of the Western Mediterranean. Its natural and strategic bay allowed it to control the routes linking east to west, becoming an obligatory stop for ships crossing the sea. The city grew at an impressive pace, attracting not only Phoenicians but also local populations who integrated into its urban life. In a short time, Carthage surpassed its mother city in power and influence, becoming the brightest jewel of Phoenician expansion and a future protagonist of epic confrontations against Rome. Beyond Carthage, the Phoenicians founded many other significant colonies. Utica, also in North Africa, was one of the earliest settlements, serving as a base for voyages westward. On the Iberian Peninsula, cities such as Gadir, known today as Cadiz, acted as trading posts for precious metals, especially silver and tin, essential for the production of weapons and tools. In Sardinia, Sicily, and Malta, the Phoenicians established colonies that functioned as supply stations, ship repair points, and cultural exchange hubs. These locations were not merely logistical stops, but dynamic centers that received local influences while transmitting elements of Phoenician culture, such as language, writing, religion, and craftsmanship. The logic behind this expansion was clear. The Phoenicians did not seek to build vast territorial empires, but rather to weave a network of maritime and commercial control. Each colony acted as a link in a chain that guaranteed security for the routes and access to strategic resources. This decentralization gave them a remarkable advantage, for while great empires fell under the weight of invasions or internal crises, the Phoenicians could reorganize themselves from different centers. When a city-state in the Levant suffered under the pressure of empires like the Assyrians or Babylonians, colonies such as Carthage ensured the continuity of their influence in the Mediterranean. This resilience explains the longevity of Phoenician presence even amid political and military adversities. Phoenician colonial expansion also had a profound impact on the local populations they encountered. In many regions, the Phoenicians did not impose their culture aggressively, but integrated with communities, establishing relations of trade and cooperation. The result was an intense process of cultural exchange. Phoenician techniques of navigation and craftsmanship spread outward, while elements of local traditions were incorporated into colonial customs. This cosmopolitanism reinforced the image of the Phoenicians as cultural mediators, capable of absorbing and transmitting influences without losing their own identity. In the colonies, temples were built in honor of gods like Melkart and Astarte, but there was also room for adaptations that engaged with local cults, creating a hybrid and dynamic religiosity. In summary, Phoenician colonization was the secret to their longevity and historical reach. Instead of erecting a continental empire, they built a maritime empire, based on mobility, diplomacy, and commercial efficiency. Carthage, Utica, Gadea, and many other colonies became not only ports but true extensions of Phoenician civilization, spreading their language, writing, and products across distant territories. This system allowed a people with a limited territorial base in the Levant to become protagonists of Mediterranean history. Phoenician expansion was, therefore, the ultimate proof that the sea, far from being a barrier, could be the infinite road to glory and power. Among all the colonies founded by the Phoenicians, none achieved as much splendor and power as Carthage, the city that would become the great pride of their civilization in the western Mediterranean. Located in a strategic position in North Africa, Carthage began as an extension of the city of Tyre, but in a short time surpassed its mother city in wealth, influence, and historical prominence. Its foundation, shrouded in legends and traditions, reflects the practical yet mythical character that permeated Phoenician expansion. More than a simple trading post, Carthage became an urban empire, heir to the naval ingenuity of its founders and to the diplomatic and commercial skills that characterized the Phoenician people. According to tradition, the city was founded around the 9th century before Christ by settlers from Tyre, led by a legendary figure, Dido, also known as Elissa. Ancient sources, especially the Romans, told her story as that of a princess who fled her homeland after political disputes and established a new home on African soil. Dido's narrative, marked by courage, intelligence, and sacrifice, became a symbol of Carthaginian origins, conveying the idea that the city was born from the indomitable spirit of the Phoenicians. Even if surrounded by myth, this founding reflects the typical pattern of Phoenician expansion, a community of navigators who, in search of new horizons, turned a promising bay into a thriving urban center. The success of Carthage was largely due to its privileged location. Situated on a peninsula with a wide natural bay, the city controlled maritime traffic that connected the eastern and western Mediterranean. Its port was monumental, divided into two main areas, one dedicated to commerce and the other to military use. The military harbor, in particular, was a marvel of ancient engineering, circular in shape and capable of housing hundreds of ships, each with its own dock. This structure not only protected the Carthaginian fleet from external attacks, but also allowed constant maintenance of vessels, ensuring the maritime supremacy that would characterize Carthage for centuries. It was a true beating heart, from which ships loaded with goods from all corners of the Mediterranean departed and arrived. Carthage's economic development was impressive. The city prospered with the trade of precious metals from the Iberian Peninsula, wheat and barley from North Africa, as well as luxury goods such as Phoenician purple, glass, and ceramics. Its economy was diversified, combining maritime activities with highly organized local agriculture, that took advantage of the fertile lands of the region to secure abundant supplies of grain, olive oil, and wine. Unlike smaller Phoenician colonies, which depended exclusively on maritime trade, Carthage managed to integrate sea and land, becoming self-sufficient in many aspects and accumulating surpluses that further strengthened it. This economic balance gave the city a solid foundation to expand and confront powerful rivals. From a cultural and religious standpoint, Carthage preserved the Phoenician legacy, but also developed its own traits. Gods such as Baal-Hamon and Pum, Tanit, assumed central roles in the Carthaginian pantheon, reflecting both Tyre's heritage and adaptation to the new African environment. Grand temples were erected in their honor, and religious festivals mobilized the entire population. Although practices such as human sacrifice are described in ancient sources, often exaggerated by Roman enemies, it is certain that Carthaginian rituals were notable for their intensity and for the deep connection between religion and political power. In Carthage, as in the original Phoenician cities, the sacred was at the center of social life, and the gods were seen as direct protectors of the city's prosperity and expansion. Over time, Carthage ceased to be just a colony and became an autonomous power, able to rival traditional empires. Its naval fleet, accumulated wealth, a network of colonies and trading posts in the western Mediterranean turned it into the principal heir of the Phoenician tradition. When the power of the Levantine cities began to decline under the pressure of the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians, Carthage assumed the role of guardian and continuer of Phoenician civilization, keeping its commercial, religious, and cultural practices alive. More than that, it expanded this legacy, creating its own empire that would dominate the political and economic scene of the region for centuries. Thus, Carthage represented both the peak of Phoenician expansion and the birth of a new identity. On one hand, it remained tied to Tyre as the daughter of its tradition. On the other, it grew to the point of eclipsing its metropolis, becoming a symbol of Phoenician resilience and adaptability. With its wealth, its fleet, and its strategic position, Carthage not only became the Phoenician pride in Africa, but also the city that would face Rome in one of antiquity's most legendary rivalries. Although Carthage became the greatest symbol of Phoenician expansion, it was not the only relevant colony. The Phoenicians built a true network of cities along the shores of the Mediterranean, each with a strategic function to sustain trade, ensure the resupply of ships, and expand their cultural influence. These colonies were like luminous points, scattered across seas and islands, connecting east and west in a web of maritime routes that only the Phoenicians could maintain with such skill. Among them, Utica, Gadire, and several others stood out, together forming the backbone of the Phoenician maritime empire. Utica, also located in North Africa, was one of the earliest known Phoenician colonies, founded even before Carthage. Situated in a fertile region close to the sea, it served as an essential trading post for the routes linking the Levant to the western Mediterranean. For centuries, Utica thrived as a redistribution center, receiving goods from the Iberian Peninsula and sending them to cities in the east. Even after the rise of Carthage, Utica maintained its importance, remembered for its longevity and strategic position. Its existence proves that the Phoenicians did not rely on a single great colony, but rather on multiple hubs that ensured the continuity of their maritime network. Another key example was Gadire, located on the Iberian Peninsula, at the site of present-day Cadiz. Considered by many scholars as one of the oldest cities in the West, Gadire was one of the main links between the Phoenicians and the mineral wealth of the region. From the Iberian Peninsula, Phoenician ships transported silver, copper, and above all, tin, a rare and indispensable metal for the production of bronze. There is evidence that, from Gadire, Phoenician expeditions may have reached even the British Isles in search of tin deposits. This role as a bridge between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic made Gadire one of the pillars of Phoenician expansion, providing access to resources that no other region could offer in such abundance. Its location, close to the Strait of Gibraltar, also allowed control of one of the most important navigation points of the ancient world. Beyond Utica and Gadire, the Phoenicians founded numerous other colonies that expanded their reach across the Mediterranean. In Sicily, they established cities such as Motia and Panormus, which served both as trading centers and as military posts to protect their routes. In Sardinia, they created outposts that allowed them to exploit mineral resources and dominate strategic passages. In Malta, their colonies functioned as resupply bases at the very heart of the Mediterranean, essential for long-distance voyages. Each of these cities had a specific role, but together they formed a solid network that turned the sea into a Phoenician space, where their ships circulated with safety and efficiency. The extent of their colonization was astonishing. From the Levant to the Atlantic, it was almost impossible to sail without encountering a port under Phoenician influence. What makes this colonization even more remarkable is the way the Phoenicians adapted to local realities. Instead of imposing military domination over native peoples, they preferred to negotiate, trade, and integrate with communities. Phoenician colonies were often multicultural spaces, where local traditions blended with Phoenician elements. The alphabet, religion, artisanal techniques, and luxury products spread outward, but external influences were also absorbed, creating a hybrid identity. This flexibility explains in part the durability of the colonies, which survived even after political changes in the Levantine metropolises. Phoenician culture was not imposed, but shared, which facilitated its acceptance in such diverse territories. This network of colonies was one of the greatest achievements of Phoenician civilization. With it, the Phoenicians secured not only material wealth, but also the continuity of their culture in distant regions. When the Levantine cities fell under the domination of empires such as the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian, colonies like Carthage, Utica, and Gadir kept Phoenician heritage alive, ensuring that their influence did not disappear. These cities were, in essence, proof that the Phoenicians had turned the Mediterranean into their home, planting roots that would endure even after the fall of their original cities. Thus, when we look at Utica, Gadir, and many other colonies, we see how the Phoenicians managed to turn the sea into their own territory. Every port founded was more than a trading station. It was a piece of the Phoenician spirit planted in foreign lands. It was this ability to expand without dominating, to integrate without losing identity, that ensured the Phoenicians a unique role in history. Their presence spread like waves across the Mediterranean, and each colony became a witness to the ingenuity of a people who made the sea their homeland and colonization their form of eternity. The relationship between the Phoenicians and Egypt was one of the oldest and most complex of antiquity. From the first commercial contacts, as early as the 3rd millennium before Christ, the Phoenician cities were already sending cedar wood, resins, and handcrafted objects to the Nile Valley, in exchange for gold, papyrus, grains, and luxury items produced by Egyptian civilization. This early exchange, marked by cooperation, established bonds that would last for centuries, but also opened the door to tensions, disputes, and attempts at control. Egypt saw the Levantine cities not only as essential suppliers, but also as strategic points to ensure influence over the eastern Mediterranean. The Phoenicians, in turn, knew how to alternate between submission, diplomacy, and resistance, preserving their autonomy whenever possible. During the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, around the 20th century before Christ, Byblos was already one of Egypt's main trading partners. The cedars of Lebanon were indispensable for the construction of ships, temples, and sarcophagi, and the Phoenicians became privileged suppliers of this resource. The relationship was so close that Egyptian inscriptions mention gifts and treaties with the kings of Byblos, showing that even at that time, the Phoenicians were regarded as valuable allies. Trade with Egypt not only enriched the Phoenician cities, but also brought them prestige, consolidating their role as intermediaries between the Nile Valley and other regions of the Middle East. However, the balance between partnership and domination began to change during the New Kingdom of Egypt, especially from the 15th century before Christ onward. Pharaohs such as Thutmose III and Ramses II expanded Egyptian power into the Levant, incorporating Phoenician cities into their sphere of influence. Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre began to pay tribute, and in return, they received military protection and privileged access to the Egyptian market. This vassalage, though burdensome, also guaranteed some stability to the Phoenician cities, allowing them to continue prospering under the shadow of Egyptian power. The temples of Karnak and Luxor record military campaigns in the Levant, but they also depict Phoenician embassies bringing gifts and reaffirming their loyalty to the pharaoh. Despite the domination, The Phoenicians never ceased to be recognized for their importance as merchants and craftsmen. Egyptian documents describe the arrival of Phoenician ships laden with wood, wine, olive oil, and luxury objects, which were received as tributes or diplomatic gifts. This constant presence consolidated Phoenician influence in Egypt to the point where cultural elements were shared. The Phoenicians adopted Egyptian artistic and religious techniques, while Phoenician products circulated among the Nile elites. This cultural exchange turned the relationship between the two peoples into a two-way street. Even under domination, the Phoenicians left their mark on Egyptian culture, and Egypt left profound impressions on the religious and artistic life of the Levant. Over time, especially from the 12th century before Christ onward, the weakening of Egypt opened new opportunities for the Phoenicians. The crisis that followed the invasions of the Sea Peoples and the decline of pharaonic power allowed cities like Tyre and Sidon to regain greater autonomy and expand their trade routes without the weight of tribute. This moment of freedom was crucial for the rise of Phoenician navigation, which began to dominate the Mediterranean with even greater intensity. Paradoxically, the period of greatest Egyptian influence in the Levant ultimately prepared the Phoenicians to become even more resilient and independent, seizing the power vacuum left by the decline of the pharaohs. The relationship between Phoenicians and Egyptians, therefore, was marked by a mixture of cooperation, domination, and cultural exchange. The Phoenicians had to constantly negotiate their position, at times as indispensable partners, at times as tributary vassals. But in every circumstance, they managed to preserve what was most essential to them: their maritime vocation and commercial capacity. This ability to adapt to cycles of power explains how, even in the face of giant empires like Egypt, they maintained their relevance. Ultimately, the Phoenicians were not merely subjects of the pharaohs, but also their suppliers, allies, and in many ways, masters in the art of connecting worlds. If Egypt represented for the Phoenicians an ancient partner, and at times a powerful overlord, contact with the Assyrians brought even harsher challenges. The Assyrian Empire, especially between the 9th and 7th centuries before Christ, stood out for its military aggressiveness and its constant pursuit of territorial expansion. Assyrian kings saw Phoenician cities not only as sources of wealth, but also as strategic pieces in their policy of domination over the Near East. The Phoenician coast was vital for controlling the trade routes of the eastern Mediterranean, and its wealthy cities were viewed as coveted prizes. Thus, Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre endured centuries of confrontations, tributes, and revolts, attempting to balance forced submission with the preservation of their autonomy. The Assyrians demanded heavy tributes from the Phoenician cities, often in the form of silver, gold, ivory, cedar wood, and purple textiles. These tributes were recorded in royal inscriptions, where Assyrian kings boasted of the riches extracted from conquered peoples. For the Phoenicians, paying tribute was a pragmatic strategy. By accepting formal domination, they could continue their trade while avoiding the destruction of their cities. However, this balance was constantly tested. Cities such as Sidon and Tyre rebelled at different times, refusing to pay tribute or attempting to escape Assyrian control. These uprisings were punished with severity, including sieges, deportations, and exemplary executions. The city of Tyre, in particular, became a symbol of Phoenician resistance. Protected by its walls and insular location, it managed to withstand long Assyrian sieges. One of the most famous took place under King Shalmaneser V and continued under his successor, Sargon II, in the 8th century before Christ. Despite years of blockade, the Phoenicians managed to survive thanks to maritime supply, demonstrating their naval skill and resilience. This episode illustrates the difficulty even the powerful Assyrian army faced in completely subjugating a city shielded by the sea. Tyre thus became an example of the Phoenicians' ability to resist, even in the face of much stronger enemies. The confrontations also reveal the role of the Phoenicians as diplomatic intermediaries. In many cases, they sought to negotiate with the Assyrians, sending gifts and emissaries to secure treaties that granted them some degree of autonomy. This skill in dealing with greater powers was part of their identity. When war could not be avoided, they resorted to diplomacy and cunning. This flexibility allowed some Phoenician cities to remain prosperous even under the weight of tribute. However, Constant Assyrian pressure also generated instability and encouraged the search for alternatives, such as maritime expansion and the strengthening of distant colonies, which served as an economic and political safety valve. Beyond tributes and sieges, Assyrian domination left cultural and political marks. Assyrian inscriptions and reliefs depict kings receiving Phoenician envoys and shipments of tribute, showing how these cities were integrated into the imperial system. At the same time, Assyrian influence was reflected in aspects of Phoenician art and religion, which absorbed foreign elements without losing their essence. This forced exchange once again demonstrates the Phoenician ability to absorb external influences and turn them into part of their cultural identity. Instead of being crushed by Assyrian force, the Phoenicians managed to survive and, in a way, even benefit from the contact, remaining indispensable commercial mediators. Ultimately, the clashes with the Assyrians highlight the paradox of Phoenician civilization, small in territory and population, but great in resilience and ingenuity. They paid tributes, endured sieges, and accepted humiliations, but never ceased to be protagonists of maritime trade and international diplomacy. Even under the overwhelming weight of the Assyrian Empire, the Phoenicians showed that their strength did not lie in armies, but in the sea, in trade routes, and in their capacity for adaptation. It was this skill that ensured their survival in times of oppression and allowed them to continue spreading their influence far beyond the walls of their cities. After the constant pressure from the Assyrians, the Phoenicians faced another relentless power from Mesopotamia, the Babylonians. Under the rule of the Chaldean dynasty, especially during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, in the 6th century before Christ, Babylon became the new dominant force in the Middle East. For the Phoenicians, this meant yet another cycle of adaptation and resistance in the face of an empire that, like the Assyrians, sought to control both the politics and the resources of the Levant. Once again, cities like Tyre and Sidon were forced to endure taxation, military sieges, and formal submission, while at the same time striving to preserve the maritime trade that was their true reason for existing. The city of Tyre, once again took center stage in resistance. When Nebuchadnezzar II extended his authority over the Levant, he ordered Tyre to be besieged after the city refused to fully submit to Babylonian domination. This siege became one of the most remarkable episodes in the military history of antiquity. According to reports, it lasted 13 years, from approximately 586 to 573 before Christ. Despite constant pressure, the Babylonians found it extremely difficult to conquer a city built on a fortified island, protected by walls and sustained by maritime supply. Tyre's resistance was so extraordinary that even after the long blockade, the city was not destroyed but instead accepted some degree of vassalage in exchange for preserving its autonomy and its commerce. This resilience demonstrates how Phoenician geography and maritime vocation were as powerful as any land army. Sidon and other cities of the Levant were less fortunate. Many surrendered more quickly or were brought directly under Babylonian control. The heavy taxation and the imposition of local governors weakened part of the Phoenician elite. But even so, commercial activity persisted. The Babylonians, much like the Assyrians before them, understood that the Phoenicians were irreplaceable in the arts of navigation and trade. For this reason, even when subjugating them, they did not completely destroy their cities, but sought to incorporate them as gears within their imperial machine. Phoenician ships continued to transport luxury goods, precious metals, and timber to feed the Babylonian economy, while keeping alive the maritime network that extended as far as the western Mediterranean. From a cultural and political standpoint, Babylonian presence also left its mark. The forced coexistence brought new religious and artistic elements that blended with Phoenician traditions. Texts from the period mention the close relationship between Babylonian kings and Phoenician rulers, even though this relationship was marked by inequality. For the Phoenicians, submitting to the Babylonians was more a matter of survival than of choice. They preferred to formally yield to imperial domination, paying tributes and accepting imposed governors, rather than see their cities utterly destroyed. This pragmatic strategy allowed them to endure the Babylonian period without losing their essential identity, preserving temples, ports, and cultural practices. Another important aspect was the indirect connection between the Phoenicians and the Jews exiled in Babylon. As commercial intermediaries of the region, the Phoenicians were in constant contact with peoples who also lived under the shadow of Babylonian domination. This proximity contributed to cultural exchanges and the circulation of ideas, once again highlighting the Phoenicians' role as mediators between different worlds. Their language, writing system, and even religious elements echoed among neighboring communities, reinforcing the image that, even in times of submission, the Phoenicians continued to exert influence. In summary, the Babylonian period was yet another chapter in the Phoenicians' struggle to preserve their autonomy in the midst of giant empires. Besieged, taxed, and pressured, they resisted with the strength of the sea, using their fleet and strategic position as defenses against total destruction. The history of their relationship with Babylon reveals the Phoenician paradox, a people small in territory and population, but great in ingenuity, able to survive under the shadow of the most feared empires of antiquity. This resilience enabled them to weather yet another historical storm and prepare the way for the arrival of another colossal power that would dominate the East, the Persian Empire. With the rise of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, in the 6th century before Christ, the Phoenicians entered a new stage of their history. After enduring centuries of Assyrian and Babylonian pressure, their city-states became part of one of the greatest empires of antiquity, led by Cyrus the Great, and later expanded by kings such as Darius the Pars and Xerxes. For the Persians, the Phoenicians were not merely another conquered population, they were strategic partners, essential to the functioning of the empire. Their naval and commercial skills were indispensable to the Persians, who possessed vast territories but lacked maritime tradition. Thus, the integration of the Phoenicians into the Persian Empire was marked less by destruction and more by cooperation, though always under the condition of vassalage. The Persians knew how to take full advantage of the Phoenician maritime vocation. While the empire stretched from the Iranian plateau to the Nile Valley, from the Indus to the shores of the Aegean, control of the seas was vital to ensure communication, troop movements, and the circulation of wealth. It was at this point that Phoenician cities became indispensable. Their ports, such as those of Sidon and Tyre, were transformed into Persian naval bases, and their shipyards produced vessels that served in the empire's military campaigns. Experienced and feared Phoenician sailors were incorporated into the Persian fleets, becoming key elements in decisive battles. The very fame of the Persian navy during the Greco-Persian Wars owed much to Phoenician expertise, which provided both ships and crews. One of the most emblematic episodes of this collaboration was the Battle of Salamis in 480 before Christ, during Xerxes' invasion of Greece. A large part of the Persian fleet was composed of Phoenician ships coming from Tyre, Sidon, and other Levantine cities. Although the Persians suffered ultimate defeat, the Phoenicians' participation demonstrated their prominence on the international stage, even as vassals of a larger empire. Greek accounts, even when hostile, acknowledged the skill of Phoenician sailors and their central role in combat. This presence reinforced the image of the Phoenicians as navigators par excellence, whose importance transcended political and cultural boundaries. On the internal front, integration into the Persian Empire also brought economic benefits. The Phoenician cities gained political stability and could continue to expand their trade under the empire's protection. Unlike other conquerors, the Persians valued cultural diversity and allowed subject peoples to maintain their religious and social traditions as long as they paid tribute and recognized royal authority. This relatively tolerant policy favored the Phoenicians, who were able to maintain temples dedicated to Baal, Astarte, and Melkart, while benefiting from access to the vast Persian trade routes. Phoenician timber, purple dye, glass, and craftsmanship continued to circulate, now on an even larger scale, reaching distant lands thanks to the empire's territorial reach. Nevertheless, the relationship between Phoenicians and Persians was not free from tension. The city-states still valued their autonomy and at times resisted Persian demands. The heavy tribute and the obligation to supply ships and men for military campaigns caused discontent. Sporadic revolts occurred, though they were quickly crushed by Persian military superiority. Even so, the Persians never sought to completely destroy Phoenician cities, precisely because they understood their strategic importance. This balance, Pragmatic submission combined with relative cultural freedom kept the Phoenician region prosperous for nearly 2 centuries under Achaemenid rule. Culturally, the Persian period reinforced the role of the Phoenicians as mediators. As part of an empire spanning 3 continents, the Phoenicians intensified their role as commercial and cultural intermediaries between East and West. Their language and alphabet continued to spread, influencing neighboring peoples. Their religion remained alive while also absorbing Persian elements. Their identity, though subjected, remained resilient, as it had in earlier periods of foreign domination. This ability to preserve what was essential while adapting to external circumstances was the key to Phoenician survival. Thus, under the Persian Empire, the Phoenicians experienced a period of strategic integration that allowed them to maintain economic vitality and cultural relevance. They were vassals but also indispensable allies, whose naval and commercial contributions gave the Persians crucial advantages in their campaigns. Once again, the Phoenicians proved to be a people who knew how to transform submission into opportunity, using their ingenuity and maritime vocation to remain at the center of history. Even under the weight of colossal empires, they continued to be what they had always been, the masters of the sea, who made the Mediterranean their homeland. The contact between Phoenicians and Greeks was one of the most significant encounters of antiquity, marked both by cooperation and rivalry. On one side, the Phoenicians, with their millennia-old tradition of navigation and commerce, already dominated Mediterranean routes when the Greek communities began to emerge as maritime powers. On the other, the Greeks, in full expansion from the 8th century before Christ, sought new territories, colonies, and commercial opportunities. This inevitable clash between 2 maritime civilizations produced not only disputes, but also an intense cultural exchange that would profoundly shape the future of the Mediterranean. One can say that the relationship between Phoenicians and Greeks was at once one of competition and mutual learning. The Greeks were directly impacted by the Phoenician legacy, especially in writing. The Greek alphabet, the foundation of all Western literary tradition, is a direct adaptation of the Phoenician alphabet. By adding vowels to the Phoenician system, the Greeks created a more precise tool for recording their language, while the essence of the script remained the same. This cultural borrowing was of inestimable importance. Without contact with the Phoenicians, Greek literature, including Homer, Hesiod, the philosophers, and classical playwrights, might not have achieved the written form we know today. Moreover, many elements of Greek religion also had Phoenician parallels. The Phoenician goddess Astarte was associated with Aphrodite, and Melkart, the god of Tyre, was identified with Hercules. This religious syncretism shows how the Greeks absorbed and reinterpreted Phoenician influences, embedding them into their own mythology. In the realm of commerce, however, relations were far more tense. The Phoenicians already controlled vital routes of the Western Mediterranean, including colonies in Cyprus, Sicily, Sardinia, and the Iberian Peninsula. When the Greeks began their colonial expansion, advancing into similar regions, confrontation was inevitable. Places such as Sicily and southern Italy became points of direct clash between Greek and Phoenician colonies. In many cases, disputes were resolved by force, with naval battles and local wars. These rivalries, though harsh, did not prevent cooperation and coexistence. Greek and Phoenician merchants often met in the same ports, exchanging products, techniques, and even artistic styles. Art and craftsmanship offer clear evidence of this exchange. Phoenician objects such as jewelry, ceramics, and ivory work have been found in excavations of Greek cities, highlighting the prestige of Levantine products. At the same time, the Phoenicians absorbed Greek aesthetic influences, creating an artistic dialogue that enriched both cultures. Even the design of ships shows reciprocal influence. While the Greeks learned Phoenician techniques of shipbuilding, the Phoenicians assimilated certain Hellenic innovations. This constant exchange meant that, despite disputes, there was a true circulation of ideas that contributed to the flourishing of the ancient Mediterranean. Another important aspect of this relationship was diplomacy. At certain moments, Phoenician and Greek cities formed temporary alliances to face common enemies, as during the Persian campaigns against Greece. At other times, rivalries were so intense that they generated prolonged conflicts. Even so, it is undeniable that competition between the two peoples acted as a driver of innovation. The The desire to surpass their rivals pushed both Greeks and Phoenicians to seek new routes, found new colonies, and develop better techniques of navigation and trade. The Mediterranean thus became a dynamic space in which these two cultures competed while simultaneously influencing one another. In summary, the relationship between Phoenicians and Greeks was a mixture of rivalry and cooperation, marked by intense commercial disputes, cultural clashes, and deep influences. The Phoenicians bequeathed to the Greeks not only an alphabet, but also part of their religious imagination and naval techniques. The Greeks, in turn, challenged Phoenician dominance, contributing to a Mediterranean that was increasingly plural and competitive. This interaction shaped the region's balance of power and laid the foundations for the rise of classical Greece, and later, the great confrontations between Carthage, the Phoenician heir in the west, and Rome. The Trojan War, immortalized by Homer's poetry and the Greek epic tradition, was long interpreted merely as myth. However, even though it is wrapped in legend, it also reflects the commercial and cultural dynamics of the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. Within this context, the question arises, what role might the Phoenicians have played in such an emblematic conflict? Even if they do not appear as protagonists in the Homeric poems, archaeological evidence and historical references suggest both an indirect and perhaps direct Phoenician presence in this complex world of war, trade, and diplomacy. After all, the Phoenicians were above all tireless traders and cultural mediators, and it is unlikely they would have remained on the sidelines of an event that involved so many regional powers. The first point to consider is that the Phoenicians controlled vital trade routes in the Eastern Mediterranean around the period traditionally associated with the Trojan War, circa the 12th century before Christ. Their city-states, such as Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, were already renowned for supplying timber, metals, and luxury goods to Egyptians, Hittites, and Mycenaeans. In this context, it is plausible that the Phoenicians played a logistical and economic role, providing ships, cedar wood, or even goods for the armies involved. Although Homer does not mention them explicitly, their absence may be explained by the epic nature of the narrative, which favored warrior heroes over merchants who ensured the war's infrastructure. Even so, the fact that Mediterranean trade did not cease during this period indicates that the Phoenicians likely continued operating behind the scenes, profiting from the heightened demand for supplies. Later traditions suggest that the Phoenicians were recognized by the Greeks as highly skilled seafarers even at that time. It is possible that Phoenician ships were hired or requisitioned as part of allied or enemy fleets, strengthening the maritime logistics that sustained such long campaigns. The Hittites, for example, with whom the Phoenicians had commercial ties, were directly involved in the balance of power in the region that included Troy. The Phoenicians' geographic and economic proximity to these peoples makes it plausible that they participated indirectly in the supply of food, weapons, and perhaps even manpower. In ancient wars, mercenaries and sailors were often hired, and the Phoenicians were well known precisely for their maritime expertise. From a mythological perspective, there are also mentions of typically Phoenician products present in the Greek imagination of the Trojan War. Fine textiles and luxury objects, often described in the epics, bear striking parallels with Phoenician merchandise, particularly the purple-dyed fabrics that were already recognized as prestige items. This suggests that, even if they did not play a major military role, the Phoenicians left their mark on the conflict through the circulation of goods. The discovery of Phoenician origin artifacts in archaeological excavations in the Aegean region reinforces this hypothesis, showing that Phoenician products were already integrated into the daily lives of Greek elites in the Homeric period. Another relevant point is the cultural influence of the Phoenicians on the Greeks themselves, which intensified after the Mycenaean period and during the so-called Greek Dark Ages. It is possible that memories of commercial and cultural contact with the Phoenicians were absorbed into myth, albeit indirectly. Some scholars even suggest that certain Homeric descriptions of navigation and trade reflect Phoenician practices. In this sense, the Phoenicians may not have been explicit characters in the Trojan War, but they certainly formed part of the historical context that gave rise to these narratives. Ultimately, the Phoenicians' role in the Trojan War should be understood more as economic and cultural than military. They were the merchants sailing between warring peoples, the suppliers of rare materials, the experts in shipbuilding who supported long campaigns. They did not need to appear as heroes in the poems, because their true importance was behind the scenes, sustaining the machinery that allowed life and war to continue in the Mediterranean. Even when unnamed, their presence can be felt between the lines, as the invisible architects of the connections that made such a prolonged conflict possible. Thus, the Trojan War, though remembered as a clash of kings and warriors, was also, in part, a war in which the Phoenicians played their eternal role as merchants, mediators, and builders of bridges between cultures. If the Phoenicians left their mark on the eastern Mediterranean with cities such as Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, it was in the western Mediterranean that their heritage reached its peak, mainly through Carthage, the most powerful of their colonies. However, Carthaginian growth inevitably led to confrontation with a new rising power, Rome. This rivalry was not born from a single event, but from decades of increasing tension, fueled by the clash of interests between two peoples that, in different ways, sought to control the trade and military routes of the Mediterranean. Carthage had inherited the Phoenician tradition of maritime trade and colonial expansion, while Rome emerged as a land power, but was increasingly interested in dominating the seas. The meeting of these two forces was inevitable, and gave rise to one of the greatest conflicts of antiquity, the Punic Wars. The beginning of the rivalry can be understood from the struggle for influence in the western Mediterranean, particularly in Sicily. This island, rich in agricultural resources and strategically located, was coveted both by Carthage and Rome. The Carthaginians had already established a strong presence in the region, controlling cities and trade routes. Rome, on the other hand, was expanding its control over the Italian peninsula and saw Sicily as an opportunity to project power beyond its borders. The initial contacts between Carthaginians and Romans were curiously amicable. Trade treaties and agreements to delimit spheres of influence were established, setting clear boundaries. But as Rome grew and became more ambitious, these agreements began to be strained, until peaceful coexistence proved unsustainable. The first major clash arose in the 3rd century before Christ, when Rome supported the city of Messina, in Sicily, in a conflict against Syracuse, a Greek city allied with Carthage. This episode was the spark of the First Punic War, which would last for more than 20 years and mark Rome's transformation into a naval power. Until then, the Romans had no maritime tradition, but they learned quickly, copying Carthaginian ship models and developing their own techniques, such as the corvus, a mobile boarding bridge that allowed Roman soldiers to board enemy ships and turn naval battles into hand-to-hand combat, an area where they excelled. This adaptation shows how the rivalry between Carthage and Rome was also a driver of military innovation, forcing both sides to reinvent themselves. The rivalry was not limited to military aspects, but also involved distinct worldviews. Carthage, heir to the Phoenicians, was essentially a maritime power, focused on trade, control of routes, and diplomacy. Its wealth came from exchanges, colonies, and the ability to integrate different cultures into its network. Rome, by contrast, was a land power, militaristic and expansionist, whose strength lay in its military discipline and the assimilation of conquered peoples. This contrast made the two systems hardly compatible. Where Carthage saw trade, Rome saw conquest. Where Carthage sought diplomatic balance, Rome saw an opportunity for expansion. The clash between these models was inevitable, as both vied not only for territories, but also for hegemony over the Mediterranean. The Carthaginian expansion in the Iberian Peninsula also contributed to the escalation of the rivalry. While Rome consolidated its dominance over Italy, Carthage expanded its bases in the west, exploiting silver mines and recruiting mercenary soldiers among local peoples. This strengthening was viewed with suspicion by the Romans, who feared being encircled by a foreign power that was too strong. Tension grew with each new colony, each broken treaty, each indirect conflict in neutral territories. When Rome finally decided to confront Carthage directly, it was not just a territorial dispute, but a struggle for supremacy over the entire Mediterranean. The beginning of the rivalry between Carthage and Rome marked the end of classical Phoenician supremacy and the beginning of a new phase in Mediterranean history. If the Phoenicians had been masters at avoiding direct war, preferring diplomacy and trade, their Carthaginian heirs were forced to face an enemy that did not respect diplomatic boundaries and was determined to expand its military power. The result would be one of the greatest clashes of antiquity, one that would change the fate of both powers and, ultimately, of the entire Mediterranean world. The Punic Wars were one of the largest and most intense conflicts of antiquity, pitting against each other two powers with completely distinct models of dominance. Rome, rising as a disciplined land-based force, and Carthage, heir of the Phoenician legacy, master of the seas and of commerce. Over more than a century, these wars turned the Mediterranean into a stage for decisive battles, marked by prolonged sieges, military innovations, and legendary figures such as Hannibal Barca. More than simple armed clashes, the Punic Wars represented the definitive struggle for hegemony over the Mediterranean world, and their outcome sealed the end of Phoenician-Carthaginian supremacy, opening the way for Rome's ascent as an empire. The First Punic War, between 264 and 241 before Christ, began with the dispute over Sicily, a fertile and strategic territory that interested both sides. Carthage already had consolidated influence on the island, while Rome, fresh from unifying the Italian peninsula, sought to expand beyond its borders. The conflict forced the Romans to quickly develop a naval fleet, since until then they had been essentially a land-based people. Inspired by Carthaginian ships, the Romans built their own vessels and introduced the corvus, a mobile boarding bridge that allowed them to transform naval battles into hand-to-hand combat, a field in which they excelled. This adaptation granted them unexpected victories against the powerful Carthaginian navy. After more than 20 years of war, Rome emerged victorious, conquering Sicily and imposing heavy conditions on Carthage, which was forced to pay enormous tributes. The Second Punic War, between 218 and 201 before Christ, was the most famous and dramatic of all, marked by the figure of Hannibal Barca, one of the greatest military strategists in history. After Carthaginian expansion in the Iberian Peninsula, Rome again saw its interests threatened and declared war. Hannibal, in a maneuver that impresses even today, crossed the Alps with his army and even with war elephants, completely surprising the Romans. His victories in battles such as Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae went down in history as examples of tactical genius. At Cannae, for instance, Hannibal encircled a much larger Roman army and inflicted one of the greatest defeats Rome had ever suffered. For years, Roman territory was under direct threat and the city feared for its very survival. However, Rome showed its resilience, avoiding direct confrontations and wearing down the enemy with prolonged campaigns. The turning point came when the Romans brought the war to the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa, directly threatening Carthage. In 202 before Christ, the Roman general Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, ending the war with a decisive victory for Rome. Carthage was once again forced to pay heavy tributes, lost its fleet and much of its territories, yet it managed to survive as a regional power. This survival, however, was temporary, for the rivalry was far from over. The Third Punic War, between 149 and 146 before Christ, was the final act of the struggle. Rome, already consolidated as the dominant power, saw in Carthage a persistent threat and an economic rival that still prospered through trade. Determined to eliminate its enemy once and for all, Rome launched a relentless siege against the city. The episode was marked by the heroic resistance of the Carthaginians, who fought to the very end to defend their walls. After 3 years of siege, in 146 before Christ, Carthage was finally destroyed. Its walls were torn down, its population massacred or enslaved, and according to tradition, the Romans supposedly spread salt over the land to symbolize that nothing should ever flourish there again. Although this detail is probably more legend than fact, it expresses the brutality of Carthage's end. The result of the Punic Wars was monumental. Rome emerged as the uncontested power of the Mediterranean, paving the way for the formation of its empire. Carthage, in turn, disappeared as an independent state, and with it fell the last great bastion of Phoenician civilization. The Phoenician-Carthaginian legacy, however, was not erased. Their naval techniques, commercial expertise, and cultural heritage continued to influence Rome and other peoples. But the balance of power had changed forever, and the sea that had once been Phoenician came to be called Mare Nostrum, the Our Sea of the Romans. Thus, the Punic Wars were not merely a conflict between two cities, but the clash between two forms of civilization. On one side, the maritime and mercantile model inherited from the Phoenicians. On the other, the land-based and militaristic model of Rome. The outcome sealed the fate of the Mediterranean and marked the transition from the Phoenician to the Roman era, leaving behind a history of grandeur, resilience, and tragedy. The destruction of Tyre, Carthage by Moor, in 146 before Christ, was one of the most impactful episodes of antiquity, symbolizing not only the end of a city, but also the definitive collapse of the Phoenician tradition in the Mediterranean. For centuries, the Phoenicians, and later their Carthaginian heirs, had dominated maritime routes, built prosperous colonies, and accumulated wealth that impressed kings and empires. However, the rivalry with Rome proved unsustainable. After two long and costly wars, the Third Punic War sealed Carthage's fate. What happened during that relentless siege became remembered as an example of heroic resistance and brutal destruction, a tragedy that echoed throughout ancient history. The Third Punic War began in 149 before Christ, when Rome, suspicious of Carthage's economic revival, decided to eliminate it once and for all. Despite the severe conditions imposed after the Second Punic War, loss of territories, reduced fleet, and heavy tributes, the city had managed to recover economically, rebuilding its agriculture and restoring part of its prosperity. This rebirth was seen by the Romans as an intolerable threat. The Roman Senate, led by figures such as Cato the Elder, repeated the famous phrase, "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. This climate of hostility made war inevitable, even if Carthage no longer represented the same military power as before. The siege of Carthage lasted 3 years and was marked by violence and desperate resistance. The Carthaginians, aware that they could not rival Rome militarily in open battle, chose to resist within their walls. Men, women, and even children took part in the defense, producing improvised weapons, repairing fortifications, and fighting in the streets. The city became an urban battlefield, where every street, every house, and every tower was defended until the last breath. The Phoenician-Carthaginian spirit, forged through resilience against Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians, was alive until the end. Roman accounts highlight the courage with which the inhabitants resisted, even in the face of inevitable defeat. In 146 before Christ, under the command of Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the Romans finally broke through Carthage's defenses. The result was a meticulous destruction. Walls were torn down, buildings burned, temples looted, and the population massacred or enslaved. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands were killed or sold into slavery. Carthage was razed to its foundations, and the territory was transformed into a Roman province. The famous story that the Romans scattered salt over the soil to prevent anything from growing again is probably a later legend, but it illustrates Rome's desire to completely erase the memory of its rival city. More than a military victory, the fall of Carthage was a symbolic act, the elimination of a civilization that had dared to rival Rome. The impact of this event was profound. For the Romans, the victory marked the consolidation of the Mare Nostrum, our sea, as a space under Rome's exclusive control. For the ancient world, it was the end of the last great Phoenician power, which for centuries had shaped Mediterranean trade, navigation, and culture. However, although the city was destroyed, the Phoenician-Carthaginian legacy did not vanish. The Punic language continued to be spoken for centuries in the region, and many aspects of Phoenician culture survived, incorporated into the Roman Empire. Products such as glass, agricultural techniques, and religious traditions remained alive, proving that physical destruction was not enough to erase a people's cultural influence. The fall of Carthage is remembered not only as the end of a city, but as the tragedy of an entire civilization. It represents the final chapter of the Phoenician trajectory that began centuries earlier, on the narrow shores of the Levant, when Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre launched their first ships to sea. This trajectory, marked by ingenuity, resilience, and a commercial spirit found in Carthage, its most magnificent expression but also its cruelest destiny. Even so, the Phoenician memory survived in colonies, in the accounts of ancient authors, and above all in the legacy of the alphabet and commercial practices that shaped the ancient world and continue to echo today. Thus, the fall of Carthage was not merely the end of a city, It was the closure of a historical cycle that deeply marked the Mediterranean. A tragic end for a people who made the sea their home and left as their legacy. The lesson that no physical destruction can completely erase a culture that transformed the world. When we think of the Phoenicians, our minds often turn to their great achievements, the ships that sailed across distant seas, the commercial contracts that linked east and west, or even the wars fought against colossal empires. Yet behind this grandeur existed a daily life, made up of families, markets, rituals, and ordinary tasks that sustained the city-states. Understanding Phoenician daily life is essential to seeing not only the deeds of their mercantile and political elites, but also how men, women, and children lived in Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and the colonies spread throughout the Mediterranean. It was there in everyday life that the foundation of a civilization was built, one that endured for centuries among giants. The family was the central cell of Phoenician society. Structured in a patriarchal way, it was common for the father to have authority over the children and the administration of the household, while the mother cared for domestic responsibilities and, in many cases, participated in religious activities. Wealthier families linked to commerce and politics lived in larger houses made of stone and cedar wood, decorated with fine ceramics and purple-dyed fabrics. Humble families, on the other hand, lived in simple houses of mud brick or stone, close to artisanal workshops or ports. Yet in all social strata, the family played a vital role in transmitting values, beliefs, and traditions, and was also responsible for shaping new generations of artisans, merchants, and sailors. Work in Phoenicia was extremely diversified, reflecting the cosmopolitan vocation of its cities. In the port areas, dock workers, sailors, and merchants were constant figures, unloading goods from distant lands or preparing ships for new expeditions. Artisans were especially valued. The Phoenicians were masters in the production of glass, carved ivory, jewelry, textiles, and pottery. Family workshops operated along busy streets, and professions were often passed down from father to son. In addition, farmers cultivated grapes, olives, figs, and grains in the limited fertile land, while fishermen exploited the rich waters of the Mediterranean. Even children participated in daily labor, helping with simple tasks or being introduced to the family's trade. This diversified economy sustained the cities, ensuring that long-distance trade had a solid foundation in local activities. Social life was vibrant and marked by a strong sense of community. Markets and plazas were gathering places where trade was conducted, politics discussed, and news shared by foreign travelers. Cultural diversity was evident. In the streets of Tyre or Sidon, one could hear many languages and see merchants arriving from Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even the distant West. This coexistence made Phoenician cities cosmopolitan spaces where exchanges included not only goods, but also ideas, techniques, and beliefs. Religious festivals dedicated to deities such as Baal, Astarte, and Melkart mobilized entire populations, uniting rich and poor in processions, offerings, and rituals. Religion thus permeated daily life, giving meaning to existence and reinforcing collective identity. Education and the transmission of knowledge were also part of Phoenician daily life. Although there were no formal schools like those later established in Greece, children learned early the family trade, navigation techniques, and how to read and write the alphabet. Teaching was practical, aimed at preparing each individual to fulfill useful roles within the community. For the children of merchants, this meant learning to negotiate, calculate, and communicate in different languages. For the children of artisans, it meant mastering manual techniques and continuing valued traditions. This informal education was one of the secrets of Phoenician resilience. Each generation was prepared to carry forward and expand the legacy of their ancestors. Another fundamental aspect of Phoenician daily life was food, based on local agricultural products and imported goods. Bread and wine were staples, complemented by olive oil, fish, fruits, and vegetables. The elites had access to a wider variety of meats and imported spices, while the lower classes relied on simpler but equally nutritious meals. The Mediterranean diet, today still a symbol of health, was already practiced among the Phoenicians, adapted to the possibilities of their geography. Meals also had social value, bringing families and friends together in moments of sharing and celebration. Thus, Phoenician daily life was not limited to the feats of their sailors or the opulence of their palaces. It was made of homes, hard work, religious festivals, and bustling markets. A vibrant world where families transmitted traditions, artisans created refined works, merchants risked long voyages, and entire communities gathered to honor their gods. This social fabric sustained the Phoenician civilization for centuries, ensuring that even in the face of wars and foreign domination, their culture endured. The brilliance of purple dye, the sound of coins in markets, and the scent of cedar in ports were part of everyday life, reminding every citizen that to be Phoenician was to live in constant contact with the sea, with the gods, and with the world. The grandeur of Phoenician civilization was not expressed only in their ships and trade routes, but also in their architecture and art, which reflected the identity of a people open to the world, accustomed to living alongside diverse cultures and transforming external influences into original creations. Although the Phoenicians did not leave behind monuments as colossal as the Egyptian pyramids or the Assyrian palaces, their urban architecture, temples, palaces, and artisanal works were refined and functional, shaped by the practicality of their commercial society and by the cosmopolitanism that characterized their city-states. The result was an artistic legacy that, despite the destruction of many material remains over the centuries, left deep marks on the history of the Mediterranean. In architecture, the Phoenicians excelled in the construction of temples and palaces built with stone blocks and cedar beams, a resource abundant in their region. These constructions were solid yet elegant, combining functionality and grandeur. Temples were centers of religious and political life, often erected in prominent locations, near ports or on elevated areas of the city. The presence of columns and altars demonstrates the influence of neighboring cultures such as Egypt and Mesopotamia. But the Phoenicians adapted these elements to their own style, creating more compact and practical spaces. In Tyre and Sidon, temples dedicated to deities such as Melkart, Baal, and Astarte became pilgrimage sites and symbols of the connection between religion and urban life. Although many of these buildings did not survive, ancient descriptions and archaeological findings reveal their sophistication. The Phoenician palaces were equally impressive, built to house kings and mercantile elites who ruled the city-states. Decorated with cedar wood, ivory, and precious metals, these buildings combined luxury and functionality, reflecting the wealth accumulated through maritime trade. Unlike the megalomaniac constructions of other empires, the Phoenician palaces were more discreet, but no less refined. This preference for functional elegance reveals the practical mindset of the Phoenicians, who valued a balance between ostentation and utility. Their architectural techniques even influenced the Kingdom of Israel, as attested by biblical accounts of Phoenician artisans collaborating in the construction of the Temple of Jerusalem. Phoenician art stood out mainly in small-scale artisanal works of extremely high quality, which circulated widely across the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians were masters in the production of glass, often credited as inventors or major developers of this technique. Phoenician glass, colorful and molded into delicate forms, was a luxury item coveted by foreign elites. Ivory carving also achieved great renown. Caskets, decorative panels, and small figures were meticulously crafted and exported to neighboring kingdoms. Additionally, the Phoenicians produced sophisticated jewelry in gold and silver, often with inlaid gemstones, demonstrating both technical skill and aesthetic refinement. Many of these objects have been found in excavations in Egypt, Greece, and even Rome, evidence of the reach of their artistic influence. Another striking aspect was Phoenician pottery, which, although less refined than Greek pottery, played an essential role in daily commerce. Their amphorae, used to store wine, oil, and grain, have been found in many parts of the Mediterranean, serving as archaeological testimony to Phoenician trade routes. Many of these amphorae carried marks and inscriptions, functioning as a kind of seal of quality that certified the origin of the product. This detail shows how even pottery, an everyday object, reflected the Phoenician mercantile mentality, concerned with standardizing and enhancing the value of their goods. Phoenician religious art also deserves mention. Statues of gods, amulets, and reliefs represented deities such as Astarte, Baal, and Melkart, often associated with solar, lunar, and maritime symbols. This iconography was strongly linked to nature, reflecting the concerns of a people dependent on the sea, climate, and fertility of the land. At the same time, the Phoenicians absorbed stylistic elements from Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and Greeks, creating a hybrid and cosmopolitan art. This adaptability, far from diluting their identity, reinforced their role as cultural mediators, capable of engaging with different traditions without losing their roots. In summary, Phoenician architecture and art may not have left behind monumental structures like those of other civilizations, but they shone in their practical sophistication, elegance, and capacity to circulate throughout the ancient world. More than erecting colossal monuments, the Phoenicians preferred to build ships, functional temples, and luxury objects that crossed borders, carrying their culture to distant lands. Their artistic legacy reflects a people who lived not to exalt eternal kings, but to strengthen networks of contact, commerce, and symbols that shaped the Mediterranean. In the transparent glass, in the carved ivory, in the amphorae found in excavations, the memory of their ingenuity and their ability to transform art into a bridge between cultures remains alive. The presence of the Phoenicians was not limited to maritime trade, or the colonies spread across the Mediterranean. Their influence also reached the spiritual and cultural sphere of neighboring peoples, and one of the most notable examples is the close relationship with the Hebrews, recorded in several passages of the Bible. Over the centuries, contacts between Phoenicians and Israelites were intense, whether through trade, political alliances, or religious exchanges. This coexistence left deep marks on biblical tradition, making the Phoenicians both remembered as important partners and criticized as representatives of religious practices considered dangerous or rival. Thus, the Phoenician presence in the Hebrew world illustrates how cultural and economic proximity could generate both cooperation and spiritual tension. One of the most emblematic episodes is the alliance between King Hiram of Tyre and the kings of Israel, David and Solomon. The Bible recounts that Hiram supplied cedar wood, craftsmen, and precious materials for the construction of the Temple of Jerusalem, one of the most sacred works of the Hebrew people. This gesture not only consolidated the friendship between the two nations, but also reinforced the importance of Phoenician trade as a foundation for great undertakings. The temple, the supreme symbol of Israelite faith, thus carried in its very structure the mark of the Phoenicians, who contributed both material resources and the technical expertise of their artisans. This collaboration demonstrates how Phoenician skill in working with wood, metals, and stone was recognized and valued throughout the Near East. However, Phoenician influence on Hebrew tradition was not only constructive. Phoenician religion, marked by the worship of deities such as Byblos and Mastata, frequently appears in the Bible as the object of condemnation. Kings and queens who promoted or tolerated Phoenician cults in Israel were harshly criticized by the prophets. The most famous example is that of Queen Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of Sidon, who married King Ahab of Israel. Jezebel introduced Phoenician religious practices into the Israelite court, encouraging the worship of Baal. This episode provoked a strong reaction from prophets such as Elijah, who denounced idolatry and saw Phoenician influence as a threat to the purity of faith in Yahweh. From then on, Baal and Astarte became symbols in biblical tradition of spiritual deviation and moral corruption. Despite the criticisms, the coexistence between Hebrews and Phoenicians also generated continuous cultural and economic exchange. The Israelites depended on Phoenician ports to access the Mediterranean, since their territory lacked a significant naval tradition. In return, the Phoenicians benefited from the agricultural products of the Palestinian interior, such as wheat, olive oil, and wine. This economic complementarity reinforced ties that, even amid religious tensions, remained mutually advantageous. This everyday exchange meant that Phoenician elements permeated Israelite life more deeply than is often imagined. In addition, the very language and writing ace of the Hebrews received influence from the Phoenician alphabet. The writing system adopted by the Hebrews has its direct roots in the phonetic model developed by the Phoenicians, which means that fundamental texts of biblical tradition were written from a cultural legacy originating in the Levantine cities. This detail carries monumental historical importance. The transmission of the sacred texts of Judaism and later Christianity was only possible thanks to the tool created and spread by the Phoenicians. Thus, the Bible, one of the most influential books in the history of humanity, carries at its foundation the contribution of a people specialized in transforming sounds into universal symbols. Therefore, Phoenician influence in the Bible and in Hebrew tradition was multiple and ambivalent. On the one hand, the Phoenicians appear as indispensable partners, allies, and suppliers, whose wood and craftsmanship helped build the Temple of Jerusalem. On the other hand, they appear as spiritual enemies, associated with cults and religious practices condemned by Israelite prophets. This duality shows how the contact between the two civilizations was deep and constant, leaving both material and spiritual marks. The Phoenicians, with their ingenuity, religion, and culture, ended up entering the biblical narrative not only as neighbors, but as symbols of everything that could enrich and, at the same time, challenge the faith of the Hebrew people. Among all the contributions left by the Phoenicians to humanity, none was as transformative as the phonetic alphabet. Created around the 11th century before Christ, this simplified system of writing represented a revolution in the way peoples recorded and transmitted information. Unlike the cuneiform writing of Mesopotamia or Egyptian hieroglyphs, which required hundreds of symbols and years of training, the Phoenician alphabet consisted of only 22 characters that represented consonantal sounds. This simplicity democratized writing, allowing merchants, artisans, and ordinary people to use it without relying on specialized scribes. It was, in essence, a practical tool that reflected the pragmatic spirit of the Phoenicians and their vocation for trade and communication between different cultures. The impact of this alphabet was immense because it was not confined to Phoenician city-states. As they sailed the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians spread their writing to ports, colonies, and trade routes. The Greeks were the first to adopt the Phoenician system, adapting it to their language by adding vowels. From this adaptation emerged the Greek alphabet, which became the basis of classical literature, used by Homer, Sophocles, Plato, and so many other thinkers. Later, the Latin alphabet, derived from Greek, would become the writing system of the Roman Empire, and consequently of the modern Romance languages such as Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Italian. This means that the foundation of much of today's written communication traces back to Phoenician ingenuity. Beyond the Greeks and Romans, other peoples also received the direct influence of the Phoenician alphabet. Hebrew and Aramaic derived from it, giving rise to religious and literary traditions that shaped Judaism and Christianity. Aramaic, in particular, spread throughout the Middle East, becoming a lingua franca for centuries and serving as the basis for the development of the Arabic alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet is also at the origin of the Syriac alphabet and, indirectly, of the Ethiopic alphabet. This genealogical tree shows that the Phoenician legacy was not limited to the Mediterranean, but extended across vast regions of the Near East, enduring in linguistic traditions that survive to this day. This process of diffusion demonstrates how the Phoenician alphabet was a tool of our cultural connection. It was not merely a writing code, but a vehicle that allowed the transmission of ideas, stories, and religions through time and space. Thanks to its simplicity, it made it possible for sacred texts, laws, contracts, and narratives to be preserved more accessibly. The alphabet was not exclusive to kings or religious elites. It could be learned by merchants and common citizens, which broadened the circulation of information and strengthened trade networks. This democratization of writing is, in many ways, one of the greatest legacies of the Phoenicians to humanity. The symbolism of the Phoenician alphabet goes beyond language. It represents the very identity of this people. Just as Phoenician ships crossed seas connecting cultures, their writing crossed borders, adapting to different languages and transforming into new systems. Each letter we use today in our alphabets carries in its essence the mark of this invention. When we write or read words in Portuguese, English, Spanish, or French, we are, often without realizing it, using direct inheritances of Phoenician ingenuity. In summary, the Phoenician alphabet was one of the greatest gifts ever offered to humanity. It paved the way for literature, science, philosophy, and the religious traditions that shaped both Western and Eastern civilization. Without it, the transmission of knowledge might have been more restricted, slower, and more fragile. By transforming sounds into simple and universal symbols, the Phoenicians not only facilitated communication in their time, but also created a bridge that continues to unite generations to this day. The legacy of the Phoenician alphabet is not just an ancient inheritance, it is a living presence in every page we read and every word we write. The trajectory of the Phoenicians, marked by centuries of maritime glory, prosperous trade and cultural influence, could not escape the forces of history that inevitably demanded their toll. The decline of the Phoenician city-states did not occur suddenly, but was the result of a long and complex process in which internal and external factors intertwined. From the beginning, the Phoenicians lived in a delicate position. Their cities were rich and strategic, but small in territory and population, surrounded by much larger and more aggressive empires. This structural fragility meant that, although they resisted for centuries, they were progressively absorbed or destroyed by foreign powers. The end of Phoenician autonomy did not mean the disappearance of their culture, but marked the loss of the political independence that had sustained their identity for so long. Among the external pressures, the most evident was the succession of empires that competed for control of the Levant. First came the Wassyrians, who subjected cities like Sidon and Tyre to heavy tribute, imposing their military strength with brutality. Then the Babylonians, under Nebuchadnezzar II, besieged Tyre for 13 long years, reducing its autonomy. Later, the Achaemenid Persians turned the Phoenicians into subordinate allies, exploiting their fleet for wars against the Greeks. Finally, the Macedonians, under Alexander the Great, sealed the fate of the Phoenician city-states by destroying Tyre in one of the most famous sieges in history. This succession of dominations made it clear that, no matter how resilient and ingenious, the Phoenicians could not indefinitely resist the weight of great empires. But external factors alone do not explain the decline. There were also internal weaknesses. The Phoenician cities never managed to form a lasting political unity. Although they shared language, religion, and culture, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and other city-states almost always acted independently, competing with one another for roots and influence. This division prevented them from presenting a united front against external threats, making domination by larger empires easier. In many instances, some cities preferred to ally themselves with invaders to weaken their rivals, which ultimately weakened them all in the long run. The lack of political cohesion was undoubtedly one of the greatest obstacles to the survival of Phoenician autonomy. Another factor that contributed to the decline was the gradual transfer of prominence to the Western colonies, especially Carthage. As the Eastern empires tightened their grip on the Levant, the original cities lost economic and political strength, while Carthage flourished in the Western Mediterranean. This shift of center weakened the position of the Levantine city-states, making them increasingly dependent on alliances with foreign powers to survive. Although the Phoenician spirit remained alive in Carthage, the original cities, like Tyre and Sidon, became shadows of their former glory. From a cultural and social perspective, however, the Phoenicians showed incredible resilience. Even under foreign domination, they remained active in trade, preserved their religious traditions, and kept their language and alphabet alive. This resilience allowed their culture to survive for centuries, even after the loss of political independence. Their influence was so deeply rooted in the Mediterranean that even when subjugated, the Phoenicians remained indispensable as sailors, artisans, and merchants. In many respects, their identity was preserved precisely because they adapted easily, absorbing external influences without dissolving completely. The decline of the Phoenician city-states, therefore, should not be understood as a sudden collapse, but as a process of transformation. The external pressures of great empires and their internal divisions undermined their political autonomy, but their cultural heritage endured. The sea continued to be their homeland, even when their cities were under foreign banners. Phoenician trade, art, and writing remained alive, crossing generations and leaving deep marks on neighboring peoples. Thus, although Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre lost the political brilliance they once had, their light did not go out, but continued to shine in other forms, whether in the glory of Carthage, the diffusion of their alphabet, or the memory transmitted by later civilizations. In summary, the decline of the Phoenician city-states was the result of a delicate balance broken. Surrounded by giants, divided among themselves, and eclipsed by their own colonies, the Phoenicians could not maintain the autonomy that had characterized their rise, yet their spirit survived. and perhaps that is the greatest testimony to their greatness. More than kings or walls, the Phoenicians bequeathed to the world a cultural heritage that resisted time, proving that even when cities fall, ideas and traditions can cross millennia. The destruction of Carthage, in 146 before Christ, marked the end of an era, but it did not mean the complete erasure of its presence. Even after being razed by the Roman army following the Third Punic War, the city remained a space laden with memory, ruins and scars that bore witness to centuries of Phoenician Carthaginian power in the Mediterranean. Contemporary accounts describe the brutality of the conquest. Walls torn down, temples set ablaze, populations enslaved. Rome sought to turn victory into an example for the world, demonstrating that no rival could withstand its expansion. Yet no matter how hard they tried to erase Carthage, its story continued to echo, feeding both the imagination of the ancients and the work of modern historians. After its destruction, the Romans transformed Carthaginian territory into the province of Africa, a fertile and strategic land that supplied the empire with grain, olive oil, and other agricultural products. Carthage itself lay in ruins for some time, but it was not abandoned forever. In the 1st century before Christ, during the rule of Julius Caesar and later Augustus, Rome decided to rebuild it, recognizing its strategic value. A new Carthage, now Romanized, rose upon the ashes of the old. This city, renamed Colonia Julia Carthago, grew rapidly and became one of the most important in the Roman world, rivaling Alexandria in grandeur. Thus, even in defeat, Carthage was reborn as part of the empire that had once been its greatest enemy. Romanization, however, did not completely erase the Phoenician Carthaginian heritage. Cultural and religious traces remained alive, especially among the local populations. The Punic language continued to be spoken for centuries, so much so that Roman authors mention it still being used in North Africa during the imperial period. Certain cults dedicated to deities such as Tanit and Etul, Baal Hammon, persisted, often syncretized with Roman gods. This cultural persistence shows that, even in the face of political destruction, Carthaginian identity did not disappear but transformed, integrating into the new Roman order without completely losing its roots. From an archaeological perspective, the Roman rebirth of Carthage coexisted with the remains of the ancient Phoenician city. The burned ruins and shattered walls were intermingled with new Roman-style constructions such as theaters, baths, and forums. This juxtaposition created a living memory space where the Carthaginian past remained visible and became part of the present landscape. For many inhabitants and visitors, walking through Carthage also meant recalling its lost grandeur and tragic fall. This duality of a destroyed city and a reborn one made Carthage a powerful symbol, remembered both as a defeated enemy and as a city resurrected under Rome. In collective memory, especially among the Romans, Carthage endured as an example of power and tragedy. Latin authors described the courage of its inhabitants, the wealth of its temples, and the devastation wrought by conquest. At the same time, the new Carthage prospered as a Roman metropolis, enriched by its strategic position in the Mediterranean and its abundant agricultural production. Thus, the city held two identities: the ancient Phoenician Carthaginian capital, destroyed by the might of the legions, and the new Roman colony, a symbol of Rome's ability to rebuild and integrate conquered territories. Ultimately, the fate of Carthage after its fall reveals much about how the Phoenician legacy endured. Even in defeat, the Carthaginians left marks that withstood the passage of time, in language, in religion, in traditions, and even in the memory of their conquerors. Rome could conquer territories and raise colonies, but it could not completely erase the presence of a people who had dominated the seas for centuries. Carthage, in its ruins and in its reconstruction, became living proof that even in the face of total destruction, certain cultures remain as lasting phantoms of history, reminding us of their past greatness and their eternal contribution to the Mediterranean world. For a long time, the Phoenicians remained almost an invisible civilization, remembered only through the accounts of their enemies or fragmented references in biblical, Greek, and Roman texts. They did not leave behind massive stone monuments like the Egyptians, nor immense libraries like the Mesopotamians. Their memory was shrouded in mystery, as if they had been swallowed by the very sea they so thoroughly dominated. It was only from the 19th century onward, with the rise of modern archaeology, that scholars began to reconstruct more clearly the history of this enigmatic people. Excavations in Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, Carthage, and other areas revealed ruins, inscriptions, and artifacts that gradually brought Phoenician cultural richness back into the light. Among the most remarkable discoveries are the sarcophagi and inscriptions found in Byblos. The famous sarcophagus of King Ahiram, dating to around the 10th century before Christ, contains one of the earliest known inscriptions of the Phoenician alphabet, providing crucial clues about the evolution of writing. This piece, preserved today in museums, became a symbol of the revival of Phoenician studies, showing that, even without colossal monuments, they had left enduring testimonies. Other stone inscriptions and stelae discovered across the Mediterranean confirmed the extent of their trade routes and the influence of their language, serving as direct evidence of their presence in distant regions. The rediscovery of Carthage was also fundamental to understanding the Phoenicians. For centuries, the image of the city had been shaped by Roman propaganda, which depicted it as a cruel enemy practicing barbaric customs. Archaeological excavations beginning in the 19th century and intensifying in the 20th revealed a complex metropolis with organized streets, temples, artificial harbors, and sophisticated craftsmanship. The famous circular harbor of Carthage, described by ancient authors, was partially confirmed by archaeology, proving the naval ingenuity inherited from the Phoenician tradition. These findings helped rebalance the historical narrative, showing that Carthage was not merely Rome's enemy, but also the heir to a culture of innovation and refinement. Another essential discovery was the investigation of the tuffets, Carthaginian ritual cemeteries, where urns containing cremated remains of children and animals were found. These sites reignited debate about the alleged human sacrifices practiced by the Phoenicians and Carthaginians. For some archaeologists, this was clear evidence of rituals dedicated to deities such as Tanit and Baal-Hamon. For others, the urns may have represented symbolic infant burials rather than sacrificial rites. Regardless of interpretation, these discoveries highlighted the importance of archaeology in providing material evidence for questions previously based only on hostile literary sources. In this way, material study allowed myth to be separated from reality, even though many mysteries remain. Underwater archaeology also played a vital role in reconstructing Phoenician history. Shipwrecks found in the Mediterranean revealed amphorae, tools, and goods that confirmed the extent of Phoenician trade. At sites in the Iberian Peninsula, Sardinia, and even the British Isles, objects typical of Phoenician craftsmanship, such as colored glass, amulets, and ceramics, have been discovered, testifying to the vast reach of their roots. These findings confirm that the Phoenicians were pioneers in building a commercial network that connected the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, expanding the limits of the known world. With the progress of archaeology and historical studies, the image of the Phoenicians underwent a profound re-evaluation. Once caricatured as enemies in ancient texts, they are now recognized as cultural mediators, inventors, navigators, and traders who left permanent marks on civilization. Today, Phoenician memory is celebrated not only in academia, but also as part of the cultural heritage of Lebanon and other Mediterranean regions, where their influence can still be perceived. Archaeology, by uncovering stones, inscriptions, and silent objects, restored to the Phoenicians the voice that history had attempted to silence. Thus, the modern rediscovery of the Phoenicians is itself an example of cultural resilience. Even after centuries of silence, they return to the present through the work of archaeologists and historians, proving that no civilization truly disappears as long as memory and traces remain to be interpreted. The revival of Phoenician history in the modern world allows us to understand not only their importance in the past, but also how deeply their legacy continues to live within what we are today. Among the many mysteries surrounding the Phoenicians, few spark as much curiosity as the possibility that they may have gone beyond the limits of the Mediterranean, reaching the Atlantic, and perhaps even lands far more distant. We know they were bold navigators and tireless merchants, accustomed to exploring routes that other peoples considered dangerous or impossible. This maritime vocation, combined with ancient accounts and certain archaeological findings, fuels the hypothesis that the Phoenicians were pioneers in voyages that may have taken them to the West African coast, the British Isles, and, according to more daring theories, even to the American continent, long before Christopher Columbus. The first clue comes from Herodotus, the Greek historian of the 5th century before Christ, who recounts a Phoenician expedition sponsored by Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt in the 6th century before Christ. According to him, the Phoenicians set sail from the Red Sea, circumnavigated Africa, and returned to the Mediterranean through the Strait of Gibraltar, thus completing the first recorded circumnavigation of the African continent. The most curious detail is that Herodotus, though skeptical, mentioned something intriguing. The sailors reported that at one point during the voyage, the sun rose on their right, a phenomenon that only makes sense if they had indeed crossed into the southern hemisphere. This testimony, though debated, is regarded by many scholars as evidence that the expedition truly happened. Another point of interest is the exploration of the Atlantic. The Phoenicians certainly reached the Iberian Peninsula, where they exploited silver mines and founded colonies. They advanced to the Strait of Gibraltar, known as the Pillars of Hercules, and from there sailed into the Atlantic, establishing contact with peoples on the Iberian coast and possibly the British Isles, where they obtained tin, an essential metal for the production of bronze. There are also references to voyages to the African coast in search of gold and other resources. These accounts indicate that the Phoenicians did not fear the open ocean and were capable of venturing far beyond the traditional routes of the Mediterranean. But the most controversial hypothesis is that the Phoenicians may have reached the American continent. Some scholars and enthusiasts believe that inscriptions, coins, and even artifacts found in parts of the Americas could be linked to Phoenician contact. One example is the so-called Paraíba stone in Brazil, discovered in the 19th century, which contained an inscription in characters resembling the Phoenician alphabet. The text spoke of a maritime expedition from Tyre that had reached the South American coast after becoming lost at sea. Although the authenticity of the stone is contested, this type of finding keeps the debate alive about how far Phoenician sailors might have gone. Other supposed traces, such as coins and inscriptions found in different locations, have also been cited, though many are regarded as forgeries or misinterpretations. Regardless of whether they reached America or not, the fact remains that the Phoenicians were unparalleled explorers for their time. They mastered navigation techniques that included observing the stars, winds, and ocean currents, enabling them to carry out long and risky journeys. The construction of durable ships, combined with the accumulated knowledge of generations, gave them the real ability to cover impressive distances. If they were capable of circumnavigating Africa, exploring the Atlantic, and maintaining regular routes to distant regions, it is not unreasonable to imagine that in some accidental or deliberate expeditions, they may have reached even farther than the official records suggest. Thus, the curiosities about Phoenician voyages are not merely fantastical speculation, but reflect the true daring of this people. They were the first to transform the sea into a road, to cross unknown horizons, and to connect distant cultures. Even if we cannot state with certainty that they reached America, the mere possibility is already a tribute to their courage and ingenuity. The mystery remains part of their fascination. The Phoenicians were navigators who dared to go beyond the known horizon, leaving behind a legacy that still inspires imagination and the will to explore. The Phoenicians may not have built vast empires like the Assyrians, nor erected colossal monuments like the Egyptians, but their cultural and commercial legacy deeply shaped the Mediterranean and left marks that endured across centuries. More than warriors or conquerors, they were our mediators. They created routes, connected peoples, and disseminated ideas, techniques, and symbols. Their greatness lay in their ability to unite different worlds through commerce and culture, transforming the sea into their true homeland. What they bequeathed to the world was not just material wealth, but a model of coexistence and exchange that influenced generations to come. In the haute commercial field, the Phoenicians were pioneers in building an integrated system of routes, from the Levant to the Iberian Peninsula, passing through Cyprus, Sardinia, Sicily, and North Africa. They established a network of trading posts and colonies that served as support points for their fleets. This network ensured the constant flow of precious goods, cedar wood, purple-dyed textiles, glass, jewelry, metals, and ceramics. Trade was not just the exchange of goods, but also of knowledge. The Phoenicians carried artisanal techniques and absorbed foreign practices, creating a continuous cycle of innovation. This model was so effective that it was later replicated by the Greeks and Romans, becoming the foundation of what can be called the first international trading system of the Mediterranean. Culturally, the Phoenician alphabet was their most revolutionary contribution. Created around the 11th century before Christ, it simplified writing by turning it into a phonetic system of easy learning. This alphabet quickly spread, influencing Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Aramaic, and indirectly even Arabic and Ethiopic scripts. In other words, much of modern written language carries in its foundation the Phoenician heritage. This innovation not only facilitated trade and administration, but also democratized writing, making it accessible to merchants and artisans, not just scribes and priests. Another crucial legacy was the Phoenician cosmopolitanism. Unlike peoples who sought to impose their culture, the Phoenicians stood out for their ability to absorb influences and adapt them. Their cities were true cultural crossroads where Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Greeks, and others came to trade. This coexistence allowed religious, artistic, and technical elements to circulate freely. Gods like Astarte and Melkart were reinterpreted by Greeks and Romans, becoming Aphrodite and Hercules. Phoenician artifacts found in foreign tombs carried hybrid symbols, blending styles from different regions. This ability to mix and reinvent traditions was a key part of their cultural identity. The naval legacy must also be remembered. The Phoenicians were masters in building strong, efficient ships that influenced naval engineering across many peoples. Their knowledge of navigation, based on winds, currents, and stars, was transmitted throughout the Mediterranean, paving the way for increasingly daring explorations. Without the Phoenicians, Greek maritime expansion, Carthaginian naval supremacy, and even Roman dominance at sea might not have been possible. Their accumulated expertise became collective heritage of the Mediterranean. In the religious and symbolic field, the Phoenician legacy also endured. The worship of deities linked to fertility, the sea, and nature spread, influencing neighboring traditions. Phoenician rituals, symbols, and myths were reinterpreted in different cultures, leaving traces still visible in archaeology and written sources. Thus, Phoenician spirituality did not vanish with the destruction of their cities, but was absorbed into new contexts. In summary, the Phoenician legacy in the ancient world was multiple and profound. Their mark is not in eternal walls or centralized empires, but in something even more powerful, the moxic connection between cultures. They were the invisible architects of the Mediterranean, creating bridges between peoples and turning the sea into a space of encounter rather than a barrier. Their commerce, their writing, their religion, and their cosmopolitan mindset shaped antiquity and continue to echo indirectly in the modern world. When we think of their heritage, we realize that the Phoenicians were, above all, sowers of civilization, leaving behind a trail that, though discreet, remains eternal. Throughout history, the Phoenicians have occupied a peculiar place in the popular imagination. Unlike Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, who left behind monuments, abundant texts, and glorious narratives, the Phoenicians remained for centuries a people shrouded in mystery. This absence of large, direct testimonies meant that their memory was shaped mainly by the accounts of other peoples, often enemies or competitors, and by fragmented remains revealed through archaeology. The result was the construction of an ambiguous image. On one hand, admiration for their naval and commercial skills. On the other, suspicion regarding their religious and political practices. Yet this enigmatic character only reinforced the fascination the Phoenicians still inspire today. In the ancient world, the Greeks and Romans played a central role in shaping this image. For the Greeks, the Phoenicians were daring sailors and shrewd merchants, capable of bringing rare products from distant lands. At the same time, they were viewed with suspicion as rivals competing for trade routes, and in some myths, associated with abductions and deceptions, such as the famous kidnapping of the Princess Europa, daughter of a Phoenician king. The Romans, heirs of the rivalry with Carthage, intensified the negative portrait, describing the Carthaginians as cruel enemies, greedy, and devoted to barbaric practices. This propaganda long shaped how the West remembered the Phoenicians. more as antagonists than as protagonists. However, the very absence of their own narratives contributed to the Phoenicians being surrounded by an aura of mystery. Peoples who left entire libraries told their own version of history. The Phoenicians, in contrast, left few texts, making their image dependent on the perspective of others. This apparent invisibility fueled the imagination of later generations, who saw in them a secretive civilization, guardians of maritime secrets capable of daring voyages to unknown regions. Modern theories, such as the possibility that they may have reached the Americas before Columbus, arise precisely from this void, filled by imagination based on their reputation as unparalleled navigators. With the progress of modern archaeology, this image began to be revisited. Discoveries in Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and Carthage revealed temples, harbors, and artifacts that confirmed their sophistication and ingenuity. Objects such as jewelry, glass, and Phoenician amphorae, found in distant places, reinforced the image of a people who transformed the Mediterranean into a vast network of connections. This new vision brought balance to the popular imagination. The Phoenicians ceased to be seen merely as cunning rivals or defeated enemies, and came to be recognized as builders of civilization, whose achievements were as essential as those of Greeks and Romans. In contemporary culture, the Phoenicians still appear with less prominence than other peoples of antiquity, but they continue to arouse fascination and curiosity. Their association with purple, the color of power, became a symbol of prestige. Their alphabet, the foundation of many modern languages, is remembered as one of the greatest inventions in history. Their maritime expertise continues to inspire narratives that portray them as visionary explorers. Even their religiosity, wrapped in controversies about rituals of fire and sacrifice, contributes to keeping alive the enigmatic aura of their culture. Thus, in the popular imagination, the Phoenicians occupy a place of mystery and glory at the same time. They are remembered as tireless navigators, ingenious merchants, and refined artisans, but also as figures surrounded by shadows, victims of the propaganda of their rivals and of the silence of their own records. This mixture of admiration and mystery made them a civilization that never completely disappeared from human memory. Even today, their name evokes the image of a people who dared to dominate the seas and who, even without seeking glory through war, achieved eternity through commerce, culture, and the invisible legacy they left in the world. The history of the Phoenicians is the history of a people who chose the sea as their homeland and ingenuity as their weapon. Unlike empires that sought to raise colossal walls or expand borders through war, the Phoenicians built their greatness in a more subtle and enduring way, by connecting worlds, uniting cultures, and transforming trade into an instrument of power. From the narrow strips of land in the Levant to the far reaches of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, they created a network of colonies, routes, and contacts that turned the sea into a universal road. Their naval skill, their courage as explorers, and their intelligence as merchants secured them a central role in antiquity, even if often forgotten in traditional narratives. The Phoenician legacy is multiple. It was they who developed the phonetic alphabet, which simplified writing and spread across the world, becoming the foundation for systems still in use today. It was they who perfected techniques of navigation and cartography, daring to push beyond the known horizon. It was they who created a dynamic economy, sustained by refined products such as glass, jewelry, and above all purple dye, the color that became the symbol of kings and emperors. It was also they who transmitted their culture beyond their borders, influencing Greeks, Romans, Hebrews, and so many other peoples who directly or indirectly drew from their tradition. Even after losing their autonomy to powerful empires, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Macedonians, and finally Romans, the Phoenicians demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for cultural resilience. They continued to exist as sailors, merchants, and artisans, preserving their language and customs for centuries. Their heritage survived in Carthage, in North Africa, and in every colony they founded, spreading cultural seeds that flourished in diverse contexts. Even politically defeated, they never vanished from history. On the contrary, they left such deep marks that even amid the ruins of their cities, their memory endured. The image of the Phoenicians was often distorted through the eyes of their rivals, who portrayed them as cunning, greedy, or barbaric. But archaeology and modern studies have revealed a richer and more complex truth. The Phoenicians were builders of civilization, pioneers of cultural exchange, and architects of the first great trade network of the ancient world. Their true glory did not lie in territorial conquests, but in their ability to unite different peoples through the written word, commerce, and the sea. They were, in essence, mediators who transformed the Mediterranean into a space of dialogue and exchange. Today, as we revisit their history, we realize that the traces of the Phoenicians remain present in our own lives. The alphabet we use, the roots that shaped the geography of commerce, the symbols that infiltrated religions and cultures, all of these bear something of their heritage. The Phoenicians remind us that the true greatness of a civilization is not measured only by armies or monuments, but also by the ability to build invisible bridges that span generations. They were a people who mastered the seas, but more than that, they mastered the art of connecting the world. Thus, we conclude the journey through the history of the Phoenicians by recognizing them as one of the most ingenious and resilient civilizations of antiquity. They left no pyramids or eternal colossi, but they left something even greater, the proof that even peoples small in territory can be immense in impact. The Phoenicians were sailors, merchants, inventors, and mediators, and above all, they were the masters who transformed the sea into an eternal path, leaving forever their mark on the history of humanity.